The lantern swung once in the wind, then went dark. Snow drifted across the yard, soft as flour, hiding the frozen ruts left by wagon wheels. Inside the farmhouse near Porte, the stove was still warm, but the rooms above it were empty. A child's shoe lay on the stair. A man's pocket watch ticked on the kitchen table, its owner gone. The hogs in the pen behind the orchard were restless, snuffling at the earth, pressing their snouts into the cold soil, as though something beneath it stirred. A hired hand crossed the yard with a bucket, his breath white in the November air. He did not look toward the smokehouse. He had been told never to look toward the smokehouse. Somewhere in the dark, a hinge creaked, and the widow began to sing, "The Quiet Before the Snow." "Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. This is the Bedside Historian, and here, by the low light of a single candle, we let time slip its ropes. Wherever you rest tonight, under a heavy quilt or curled by a window, in a soft chair, or on a long train carrying you home, the hour belongs to you. Whisper, if you would, into the dark where you are listening from, and what time it is on your side of the night. If this quiet suits you, please subscribe to the Bedside Historian and press the little heart to let the channel know you sat with us. It helps this small candle grow, one soft voice at a time. Now, let the mind drift backward, past the noise of the present, past the paved road and the electric hum, past the memory of anyone still living. There is a place in northern Indiana called Porte, and there is a year, 1908, in which the land there held its breath. Come, sit close. The story begins in the cold. Porte lay in a bowl of low farmland, ringed by shallow lakes and dark stands of oak. The town had once been a stop on the old stage road, then a stop on the Lake Erie and Western Railway, and by the autumn of that year, the interurban cars rattled up Michigan Avenue every hour, their bells tinkling as they crossed the flat brick streets. The courthouse stood square on the main square, with its stone steps worn smooth by farmers in muddy boots. A few blocks off, the Fox Theatre played moving pictures for a nickel. Boys ran newspapers under the gas lamps, calling the price of hogs and the news from Chicago, 60 miles to the west. At the end of November, the town smelled of wood smoke and lard. The kitchens were warm with the last of the fall canning. Jars of pickled beets stood in cool cellars, packed straw around the lids. Sausages hung in smokehouses, tied off with butcher's twine. The frost had already killed the last tomatoes in the yards along Indiana Avenue, and the leaves of the hard maples had gone brown and brittle. Every morning the air smelled of coal from the stoves, mixed with the sweeter smoke of oak and hickory from the farms outside town. When the wind turned off the lake, 12 miles north, it brought a damp cold that soaked through wool. The farmers came into Porte on market days, driving wagons drawn by patient horses. They wore heavy coats of black wool, boots stiff with mud, and caps pulled low. Their beards were often frosted white by the time they reached the square. They bought coffee at 17 cents a pound, sugar at 6 cents, salt in blue paper sacks. Butter went for around 25 cents a pound, eggs for near 22 cents a dozen. A working man in town earned less than $2 for a full day. A good milk cow cost $40. A team of strong horses could be had for $300. Farms of 160 acres, with a house and outbuildings, sold for around $6,000, and any farmer with such a place was thought to be a comfortable man. Many of these farmers were Norwegian. They had come in waves through the ports of New York and Quebec, boarding trains west to Chicago, then spreading out into the corn country of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. They kept their old tongue at the supper table. They read the Skandinaven, a Norwegian paper printed in Chicago, and the Dekra Posten from Iowa, and the letters folded inside their coat pockets were written in the careful cursive of villagers by cold Norwegian fjords. On Sundays they filed into the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church on Osborne Street, sang the hymns in their own language, and prayed for the loved ones they had left behind. When they wanted a bride, or a farmhand, or a partner in a small dairy business, many of them wrote to the Norwegian papers and answered advertisements printed there. 2 miles north of the courthouse, past the interurban line and the railroad tracks, past the old brickyard and the Clear Lake Road. A country road turned east through the flat, sandy fields. It was called McClung Road. Snow had already fallen on it twice that November, thin and dry, blowing across the ruts in the daylight and settling into the low ditches at night. Along that road stood a farm of 48 acres, marked from the road by a plain wooden gate and a single row of hard maples the previous owner had planted long ago. The house was 2 stories, painted a soft ochre colour, with a wide porch that ran along the front and one side. There was a small orchard of apple and cherry trees, a hog lot behind the barn, a dug well with an iron pump handle, and a chicken house set close to the kitchen door. The farm belonged to a widow. That much was known in the town. Her name was written in the county deed book as Belle Gunness. She had come to Porte in the autumn of 1901, purchased the property with cash, and settled her small household there. She had 3 children. Myrtle was the eldest, a quiet girl of 11 that November. Lucy was 9. Philip was 5 years old, born on the farm itself in the year 1903. A small foster child named Jenny Olsen had also lived with the family since infancy, though by 1908 she was said to be away at school in California. The children were seen sometimes at the Norwegian church in town, and at the little country schoolhouse where the road met the section line. They were said to be well fed, quiet, and always dressed in clean pinafores and coats. The widow herself was a woman of striking size. She stood tall for a woman of that time, broad in the shoulders, thick through the arms and hands. Her weight was said to be more than 200 pounds. Her face was round and pale, with heavy features and small pale eyes, and she wore her greying blonde hair pulled back into a plain knot. When she came into town, she came alone. She drove her own wagon, handled her own team, hauled her own coal from the yard. In the shops she paid in bills folded in a small leather purse, counted out slowly, and she always asked the price twice. She had a way of standing quite still when she listened. She rarely smiled. She spoke English with a heavy Norwegian accent, dropping her voice at the ends of her sentences, so that even a simple greeting sounded like a prayer half said. She was known to be pious. She kept a Norwegian Bible on the parlour table. She hired a hand from the Norwegian community whenever there was heavy work, and she paid him in cash and never in scrip. She had once been a member of a ladies' aid at the church, and she sent baskets of eggs to the sexton at Christmas. She was known also to be shrewd. She traded her hogs at the stockyards herself. She sold her orchard apples in the fall by the barrel, and her hens laid well, and the yard was clean. In an age when a widow was often pitied as a burden on the county, this widow seemed to lack for nothing. Yet in Porte there were small stories that clung to her, the way pale moths cling to a lamp. 2 husbands had died under her roof. The first had died years before, in Chicago, and only the older Norwegians in the west end of town remembered him. His name had been Mads Sorensen. He had died on a July day in 1900, and there had been talk of a heart complaint, and the doctor had signed a paper, and the story had passed. The second husband had died on the farm itself in December of 1902. His name had been Peter Gunness, a butcher from Iowa. It was said that a heavy sausage grinder had fallen from a shelf onto his head. There had been an inquest. The verdict had been an accident. Neighbours had raised their eyebrows and lowered them again, because a man was dead and a woman had been left with a small son to raise. In Porte it did not do to speak ill of a widow, especially one who paid her bills. And there was Jenny, the foster girl. She had been baptized as Jenny Olsen, the child of a poor family in Chicago. She had grown up on the farm. In the summer of 1906 she had been seen last, then said to have been sent to a finishing school in California called something plain, something without an address. Her friends had received no letters. Her natural family in Chicago had received no letters. The widow, when asked, would smile faintly and say that Jenny was studying and would return one day, and change the subject. The girl would have been 18 that November of 1908 if she had lived. The town, in its quiet way, had begun to forget her. There were other stories too, spoken low, over coffee at the roomly hotel, or in the back rooms of the grocery on Michigan Avenue. Men came out to that farm on the interurban and never came back. A carpenter from Wisconsin, a farmer from Minnesota, a widower from South Dakota with 2 grown daughters. Trunks were seen on the platform at the Porte depot, then loaded onto her wagon, then never seen again. Suits and coats and hats were said to fill her attic. The widow, when she came into town alone after such a visit, would speak of her hired hand having taken a fine gentleman back to the train, and no one liked to press her. That November, the hired hand was a slim young Norwegian named Ray Lamphere. He had worked on the farm for nearly a year. His face was pinched and pale, and his eyes were dull with drink. He had been dismissed from the widow's service in the autumn, and then rehired, and then dismissed again. He was often seen at the saloon on Detroit Street, where he drank whiskey by the small glass and muttered darkly into his cuff about the woman on McClung Road. He had loved her once, or thought he had. He now spoke of her with a strange mix of fear and fury. Once he had been heard to say that she was a devil and would burn. Once he had been heard to say that if she thought she could turn him out into the cold, she was wrong. The saloon keeper, wiping the bar with a grey rag, had told him to go home and sleep it off. The other men had turned their faces away. At night, the farm was very quiet. The lamps in the front windows were snuffed early. Only the kitchen light lingered, a soft square of gold on the snow. Beyond the kitchen, a narrow door opened onto a small side yard, and beyond that yard stood a low outbuilding that the hired hand knew well. It was set apart from the barn and the smokehouse, close to the hog pen. Its walls were of plain plank, whitewashed once and now greyed by weather. Its single door was heavy and always closed. The children were told never to go there. The hired hand, when he passed it at dusk, would cross himself, though he was not a Catholic man. The hogs, in their pen next to it, were fat that year. They had been fed well. They had been fed on scraps that no man could name, and the widow herself carried the buckets, and no one questioned a widow her habits. On the last Sunday of November, the wind rose off the lake. The Norwegian church filled with heavy coats and folded hymnals, and the pastor read from the book of Ecclesiastes, and the little organ wheezed the old tunes. The widow was not there. She had sent, by the hired hand, a small envelope of coins for the collection plate. The pastor had nodded when he saw it, and said only that Mrs. Gunness was a woman of quiet piety, and had troubles enough at home with her 3 small children. After the service, the congregation had stood in the churchyard and spoken of the coming winter. The corn had been late that year, and the price was low. There was talk of new snow before the week was out. There was talk of a fire in a barn near Rolling Prairie, and of a runaway team on the Michigan City Road. There was no talk of the widow, though her farm lay 2 miles north, and though the light in her kitchen window had burned late every night for a week. That evening, back on McClung Road, the snow began to fall again. It fell slowly at first, single flakes drifting past the lantern in the yard. Then it thickened. It settled on the roof of the farmhouse, on the roof of the barn, on the low outbuilding by the hog pen. It softened the frozen ruts of the road until they were only faint shadows in a white field. It muffled the sound of the interurban bells 2 miles to the south. It muffled, too, the sound of the hogs snuffling behind the orchard, and the sound of the widow's boots on the porch, and the low, steady singing that drifted from the open kitchen door before it closed. Somewhere far back in the yard, beyond the ochre house and the wooden gate, the earth kept its own counsel. It was frozen now, deep and hard. It would not give up its secrets until the spring, when the fire would come, and the sheriff would come, and the shovels would come, and the long silence that lay beneath the sandy loam of LaPorte County would at last begin to break. But that was still 5 months away. On this night, in the last week of November, the world was only white, only quiet, only waiting. And to understand how such a woman came to stand on such a porch, singing softly into the snow, while her hogs grew fat and her hired hand drank himself into ruin, one must go back further still. Back across the ocean, back through the years, to a poor stone farm in a cold valley in Norway, where a strong, dark-haired girl once carried buckets of milk in the blue hour before dawn, and learned very early what a hand could do when no one was watching. A Norwegian girl named Brynhild. Far to the north and east of Indiana, across a grey sea that took 9 days to cross in fair weather and 30 in foul, there lay a country of long fjords and stone farms. In the middle of Norway, tucked between the mountains and a long, cold lake called Selbusjøen, sat a parish called Selbu. It was a place of hard winters and short summers. The birch trees leaned in the wind. The grey gneiss stone pushed up through the thin soil in every field. The farmers there measured their wealth in cows and in butter, not in coins, and a family that owned 2 cows was thought to be doing well. In this parish, on a small holding called Storsetgjerdet, a girl was born on the 11th day of November, in the year 1859. Her father was Paul Pedersen Storset, a lean man with a stonecutter's hands. Her mother was Berit Olsdatter, a woman whose apron was always damp with the day's work. The baby was carried 3 weeks later, wrapped in wool blankets, down the frozen path to the old wooden church at Selbu, where the pastor dipped his fingers in cold water and gave her the name Brynhild Polsdatter Storset. In the parish book he wrote her name in careful brown ink, 1 line among many, and closed the book and set it back upon the shelf. The holding at Storsetgjerdet was a poor one. It was what the Norwegians of that time called a husmandsplass, a cotter's place, held in exchange for labour on a larger farm. The house was a low log building, black with tar, roofed in birch bark and turf. There were 2 small rooms. The kitchen had a hearth of field stones and an iron kettle hung on a chain. The other room held a plank bed for the parents, a smaller bed for the children, a chest for clothes, and a spinning wheel by the window. The window was of 4 small panes, thick and slightly green. In the winter, frost grew on the inside of the glass in long white feathers, and the children would trace their fingers along it while their mother stirred the porridge. The porridge was made of barley and oats, cooked slowly with water and a little salt. On good days there was a spoon of butter dropped into it, and the butter would melt into a small yellow eye at the centre of the bowl. On lean days there was only the porridge, and a little sour milk poured over the top. Meat was rare. In the autumn a hog might be slaughtered on the larger farm, and the cotter would be given a share of the offal, the trotters and the tongue and the tail, to salt down for the winter. Fish came from the lake in the summer, small trout and char, split open and dried on wooden racks behind the house. Coffee was for the pastor and the sheriff. In the cotter's house the drink was thin milk in the morning and boiled water with a pinch of dried herbs at night. Brynhild was not the youngest child, and she was not the eldest. Her sister Nelly, born Anna Polsdatter, was older by several years. There were other siblings besides, coming and going in the small bed by the window. 2 of them died before their 5th year, one of a fever in the spring, one of the whooping cough in the long dark of January. The little bodies were washed by the mother, wrapped in a linen sheet, and carried by the father down the same frozen path to the churchyard at Selbu, where the sexton dug a shallow grave in the frost and covered it with stones so the wolves would not come. In the parish book the pastor wrote each name in the same brown ink and closed the book again. The child Brynhild grew tall and strong. Even at 7 and 8 years old she was said to have the shoulders of a boy and the temper of one too. She could carry a full wooden bucket of milk in each hand from the barn to the kitchen, a distance of 30 paces uphill, without setting them down. She could split kindling with a small axe. She could climb the birch tree behind the house until her mother screamed her down. She had a broad face, pale, freckled across the nose in summer, and blue eyes that were said by the neighbours to look at a person a moment too long. Her hair was the colour of pale wheat, and her mother braided it tight against her scalp every Sunday morning before church. The church was a plain white stave building with a small bell tower. On Sundays the cotter's family walked the 3 miles down the valley, the parents in front, the children behind in a line, wearing their 1 set of good wool. In summer they walked barefoot along the path and put their shoes on at the churchyard gate to save the leather. In winter they wore heavy sheepskin boots stuffed with dry hay for warmth. The pastor read from a black Bible bound in leather. He preached in the old Danish tongue that the church used then, and the sermons were long, and the benches were hard, and the children were told to sit still. Brynhild sat still. She learned the hymns by heart. She learned the psalms. She learned that God was watching always from a high place, and that he would weigh every soul upon a scale at the end of the world, and that the poor would be lifted up and the proud brought low. She learned this well. At home she learned other things. She learned that a hand across the face could come very quickly, without warning, if a bucket was spilled or a word was spoken back. She learned that hunger in the stomach was a common companion, and that one did not complain of it, because complaining changed nothing. She learned to spin flax on the wheel by the window, drawing the fibre out between her thumb and finger, twisting it into thread. She learned to knit socks of grey wool from the sheep the family kept in a stone byre against the hill. She learned to read a little from the small Norwegian catechism the parish gave to every child. She learned to sign her own name in the round schoolgirl hand of the North Country, Brynhild Paulsdatter Størset. At 14 she was confirmed at the Selbu church, along with the other children of her year, dressed in a plain dark dress her mother had made from a bolt of homespun. The pastor laid his hand on her head. The organ wheezed. The old women in the back pews wept, as they did every year, at the sight of the young ones stepping into the church as adults. That autumn Brynhild left home. This was the custom for the children of cotters. They went into service on the larger farms. They earned a small wage, a place to sleep, and their food. They sent what money they could back to the small house with the tar-black walls. Her first place was a farm not far from Størsetgjerdet, a holding with 6 milk cows, a team of horses, a flock of sheep, and a stern master. She rose at 4 in the morning to milk. She carried the buckets down to the stream to be cooled. She scrubbed floors with lye soap and a stiff brush of birch twigs. She hauled water from the well in wooden pails yoked across her shoulders. She helped in the hay meadow in July, swinging a short scythe from dawn to dusk with the men, her back aching, her hands blistered and then calloused hard. She was paid, at that first place, 12 specie-daler a year, less than $3 by the reckoning of the time, and her food, and a bed of straw in the loft above the cows. She wrote no letters home, because letters cost money. She grew strong. She grew broad in the shoulder and the hip. She could carry 100 pounds of grain on her back up a hill without stopping. She could outwork the boys at the same farm, and she made sure they knew it. She was pious in the way a country girl of that valley was pious, saying her prayers each night, blessing herself before every meal, kneeling on the cold plank floor beside her bed. She was clean in her habits. She washed her face and hands each morning in cold water from the pitcher on the table. She combed her hair with a bone comb. She darned her stockings on Sunday afternoons after church. She did not laugh often. When she did, it was a low sound, in the throat, that startled the other maids. Around her, the parish went on with its old sorrows and its small hopes. A neighbour lost a boy to a cough in the spring. A cousin took ship for America and was not heard from for 2 years. The price of butter rose one summer and fell the next. The pastor at Selbu preached against dancing, against strong drink, against pride, and the young people danced and drank and were proud anyway, in the barns after the haying was done. There was one such barn dance at a farm across the ridge in the autumn of the year Brynhild turned about 18. The story that came out of it, and was whispered in Selbu for a long time after, is difficult to sift from the many stories that would later be told. But it is the story that her sister told, years afterward, to an American reporter in Chicago, and it is the story that clung to Brynhild's name in her home valley long after she was gone. The tale, as her sister told it, was this. Brynhild had gone to the dance in a plain dark dress with a white apron. She was tall, taller than most of the boys. She was by that time said to be with child, though not yet showing much beneath her heavy skirts. The father of the child, it was said, was a young man from a well-off family in the parish, a farmer's son with a fine coat and a silver watch chain across his waistcoat. He was at the dance. He was drinking. When he saw Brynhild there, so the sister said, he grew angry. He took her by the arm and led her outside behind the barn. What passed between them there in the dark, no one saw. But when Brynhild came back inside, she was doubled over, one hand pressed low against her belly. She said nothing to anyone. She walked out of the barn and down the road toward home, 3 miles in the cold. Not long after, in her mother's kitchen, she lost the child. It came out in blood and pain on the plank floor by the hearth, and her mother wrapped the small, still thing in a linen cloth and buried it in a corner of the potato field, without prayer, without stone. Brynhild did not weep. She lay in bed for 3 days. She rose on the 4th and went back to her service. The young man from the well-off family, so the sister said, sickened not long after. He grew thin. He could not keep food down. He died within the year, and the doctor called it a cancer of the stomach. He was buried with hymns in the churchyard at Selbu, with his family behind the coffin, and no one at the funeral spoke the name of the tall, pale girl who stood at the back of the crowd, in a plain, dark dress, watching the earth close over him without a tear. Whether all of this is true in every part, no man can now say. The church records at Selbu note no such child, but the poor did not always trouble a pastor for a burial in a potato field. What is certain is that in the years after, Brynhild changed. Those who knew her said she grew quiet. Her voice dropped lower in her throat. She smiled less, and her eyes stayed a moment too long on the faces of the men who spoke to her. She saved her small wages with a new care. She spoke, when she spoke of the future at all, only of America. Her sister Nellie had already gone. In the year 1874, Anna Paulsdatter had taken ship at Trondheim, sailed to Hull in England, crossed by train to Liverpool, and boarded a steamer for New York. From there she had gone by rail to Chicago, where she had married a Norwegian carpenter named John Larsen and settled in a wooden house on the west side of that smoky city. She wrote back to Selbu, in her round schoolgirl hand, of the wages there, of the shops on Milwaukee Avenue, of the Norwegian church on Erie Street. She wrote of streetcars pulled by horses, of gaslights on every corner, of fresh bread for 5 cents a loaf. She wrote that a strong girl could earn $12 a month as a servant in a fine house, more than she could earn in a year at home. She wrote, at the end of every letter, "Come." For 7 years Brynhild saved. She served in one farmhouse and then another. She wore out 3 pairs of wooden shoes. She sent small sums home to her mother, wrapped in paper, tied with string. She kept a small tin box beneath the straw of her bed, and into it she dropped every silver coin she could spare. By the autumn of 1881 she had enough. She was 21 years old. She was tall, broad, plain-faced, strong as a farm horse, and quiet as a stone. On a grey morning in late September of that year, she walked down from Selbu to the town of Trondheim, carrying all she owned in a wooden trunk lashed with a leather strap. Inside the trunk were 2 dresses, a black shawl, a hymn book, a small silver spoon, a bone comb, and the tin box with what remained of her savings. She stood at last upon a stone quay, and looked up at the black side of a steamer bound for Hull, and she paid her fare in careful counted coins, and she went aboard. Behind her lay the fjord and the small stone farms and the pasture at Selbu, and the potato field where a nameless thing was buried in a corner. Before her lay the sea, and beyond the sea, the smoke of a city she had never seen, and a life whose first husband was still, though he did not know it, walking the streets of Chicago in a shopkeeper's apron, counting out sugar and salt to Norwegian widows, and thinking his own heart sound. Passage to Chicago. The steamer that carried her out of Trondheim was called the Tasso, a small iron ship of the Wilson Line, built for the short run across the North Sea to the port of Hull in England. She stood at the rail on that grey September morning and watched the black rocks of the fjord slide past. The wind smelled of salt and coal smoke. Gulls turned above the funnel. The other emigrants, some 30 souls in all, stood in small clusters along the deck, most of them from the inland parishes, some clutching a child by the hand, some clutching a wooden box. The men wore stiff dark coats and low-brimmed hats. The women wore black shawls pinned at the throat with a bit of tin. A boy of about 10 stood beside his mother and cried softly, and the mother did not scold him, but only pressed his head against her hip and looked away. Brynhild did not cry. She stood tall in her dark dress, her wooden trunk beside her, one hand on its leather strap. The fjord narrowed and narrowed again. The little town of Trondheim shrank to a smudge of red roofs and one tall church spire. Then the open sea took the tasso, and the ship began to rise and fall on the long grey swells of the North Sea, and the passengers went below to their bunks. Steerage in a ship of that kind was a single long room in the lower part of the hull, close to the coal bunkers, with narrow wooden shelves for beds set in 3 tiers along the walls. Each shelf was 6 feet long and about 2 feet wide, with a thin straw mattress and a rough blanket. There were no doors and no curtains. Men and women slept side by side, separated only by a low partition down the middle of the room, and the children slept where they could, wedged against their mothers. The air smelled of tar and wet wool, and the sour breath of many people breathing close together. When the sea grew rough, and the sea grew rough on the second night out, the smell was worse. Buckets were passed from hand to hand. The lantern that hung on a chain from a beam swung in wide, slow arcs and threw shifting shadows across the wet planks of the floor. The food was doled out twice a day from a great iron kettle carried down from the galley by 2 sailors in canvas aprons. It was mostly a thin soup of salt beef and split peas, with hard ship biscuit on the side, biscuit so hard that the older passengers soaked it in the soup before they could bite it. There was coffee in the morning, boiled black in a copper pot and served without milk. There was a small ration of hard cheese and dried herring at midday. A tin cup of fresh water was allowed each person, twice a day, and it tasted of the barrel it had come from. Brynhild ate everything given her. She had eaten worse at home. She sat on the edge of her lower shelf, her back straight, her spoon moving steadily, and she paid no mind to the moaning of the young mother in the tier above her, who could not keep the soup down. The crossing to Hull took 4 days. On the last morning the sun came out at last, and the coast of England rose out of the mist, low and green, with white gulls wheeling above brown fishing boats. The Tasso worked her way up the wide muddy river called the Humber, and tied at a stone quay in Hull. The passengers were led off in a long line, blinking in the daylight, carrying their trunks and their bundles, and were funnelled into a shed near the docks that belonged to the emigration agency. There a clerk in a bowler hat, speaking a hurried English, checked their names against a list and gave each of them a small square of coloured paper. The paper was their railway ticket to Liverpool. It was pinned to the front of their coats, so it could not be lost. They were fed a meal of boiled potato and mutton in a long room with plank tables. They were told to sit and to wait. In the late afternoon they were marched, still in a single line, to the railway station, and packed into wooden carriages with wooden benches, 60 souls to a car, trunks stacked at either end. The train pulled out of Hull in a great cloud of white steam. It rattled through the low green fields of Yorkshire and Lancashire, past small brick villages and dark mill towns where the chimneys smoked even at evening. Brynhild sat by a window and watched. She had never seen a country so crowded. Every field was hedged. Every road was paved with stone. Every hill had a church upon it. In the towns the children were barefoot in the streets, and the women wore shawls over their heads, and the men wore heavy caps, and the smoke of coal was in everything. They reached Liverpool at midnight. They were led again, in the same long line, to a lodging house near the docks called the Norwegian Emigrant Home, run by a mission society. There they slept too to a bed on horsehair mattresses, and washed their faces at a pump in the yard, and were fed a breakfast of tea and bread and jam. On the 3rd day in Liverpool they were marched to the great side of a steamer at the Prince's Landing Stage. The ship was one of the Guion line, bound for New York, an iron vessel of some 4,000 tons, with 2 tall funnels and 3 masts, still rigged for sail. Her name is written down in some accounts as the Wisconsin, in others as another of that line, and the memory of a poor Norwegian girl on such a morning cannot now be pressed for a certain answer. What is certain is that Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturset walked up the wooden gangway on that Liverpool morning with her wooden trunk on her shoulder, showed her paper ticket to a man in a blue coat, and was sent down a steep iron ladder into the steerage of a ship bound across the Atlantic Ocean. The crossing took 13 days. Steerage in the American liners of that year was much like the steerage of the Tasso, only larger and more crowded, and the sea between Liverpool and New York was longer and more cruel. There were more than 800 souls in the lower decks. Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, Irish, some Poles and Bohemians from the great empire in the middle of Europe. They spoke a dozen tongues, and none of them spoke to the other much, because each family kept to its own bunk and its own tin plates. The food was oatmeal and salt pork and boiled potatoes and coffee. On Sundays there was a small piece of pudding with raisins in it. The lanterns burned all day because there was no window in steerage, and the light was yellow and dim. For 3 days out of Liverpool, the ship met a heavy blow from the west. She heeled far over on her long iron side, and the waves broke green across her forecastle, and in steerage the buckets slid across the floor, and the tin cups rattled in the boxes. Women wept aloud. Children screamed. An old Norwegian man from Hardanger, who had been at sea in his youth on a small fishing sloop, sat with his back against a stanchion and sang the old psalms in a low, steady voice, and this seemed to comfort some. Brynhild lay on her shelf, one hand braced against the beam above her head, and watched the lantern swing. She was not sick. She had a stomach of iron. She thought of the potato field at home, and of the small linen bundle her mother had buried in the corner of it, and she thought of the young man in the fine coat with the silver watch chain, and she thought of nothing at all. On the 10th day the wind fell. On the 12th day the sun came out warm on the deck, and the passengers were allowed up for an hour at a time to breathe the clean air. The Atlantic was flat and blue. A pod of dolphins ran along the ship's side for half an hour, cutting the water in shining arcs, and the children pressed to the rail and pointed. On the 13th day, in the pale grey dawn, a low green line rose out of the western sea, and a sailor at the rail said quietly, in English that few of them understood, that this was Long Island. By noon they could see the low shore of Staten Island to the south, and the tall spars of many ships in a great crowded harbour, and the smoke of a city that stretched away farther than the eye could measure. The steamer worked her way slowly into the North River. The passengers were brought up on deck by ranks, still in a single line, and were told to have their papers ready. A small boat came alongside with a doctor in a black coat, who climbed the ladder to the deck and walked down the line, peering into faces, asking a few questions of the ship's surgeon. He was looking for fever, for smallpox, for the trachoma of the eye, for the racking cough of the lungs. Brynhild passed his glance without a word. She was pale and freckled and clean, and her eye was clear and her tongue was pink. He nodded and moved on. The ship at last tied up at a pier on the North River, and the emigrants were herded off into a great round building of red stone at the foot of Manhattan Island, a place called Castle Garden. It was the immigrant station of the Port of New York in those years, before another was built on an island in the harbour. Inside, under a high domed roof, the light came down through dusty windows onto a wide floor, crowded with bundles and trunks and weeping wives and shouting agents. Long counters ran along the walls, where clerks sat in shirt-sleeves and wrote in ledgers with steel pens. Brynhild waited in a line of Norwegian women for 2 hours. When her turn came, a clerk with a heavy dark moustache asked her name, her age, her calling, her destination. She answered in the small English she had learned in Selbu and on the boat, giving her name as best she could shape it to his ear. He wrote her down as Bella Paulson, 21, servant going to Chicago. He stamped her paper with a small round stamp, handed it back, and waved her on. In that stamp, on that ledger line, the girl called Brynhild Polsdatter Sturset stepped quietly out of the parish book at Selbu and became, for the first time, a woman named Bella. Outside Castle Garden, agents of the railroad companies stood in a knot on the sidewalk, calling out in Norwegian and Swedish and German for the trains west. She was taken by a Norwegian-speaking agent to a shed, where a ticket was sold her for 2 days on the Erie Railroad and its western connections, from Jersey City to Chicago. The fare came to $11 and a little more than a month's wages at home, paid out of the small tin box that had crossed the ocean tied inside her dress. She was given a small cardboard box of bread and cheese and dried sausage and boiled eggs, food enough for the journey, and was pointed toward a ferry that carried her across the Hudson to Jersey City. There she boarded a wooden coach with high-backed benches, and a conductor in a blue uniform punched her ticket, and the train pulled out into the golden light of an October afternoon. For 2 days and 2 nights the train rolled west. It carried her along the Delaware River and up over the Alleghenies, past coal towns black with soot, past long white fields of stubble corn, past small wooden stations where farmers stood in overalls and stared at the cars. She slept sitting upright, her head against the window frame. She ate her bread and her cheese in small, careful bites. She spoke to no one but a Norwegian widow from Bergen, who was going to a nephew in Wisconsin, and the 2 women shared a boiled egg and a cup of coffee bought at a station in Ohio for 5 cents. On the second evening the train crossed a long trestle over a wide, slow river. The widow called the calumet, and then the sky ahead grew orange and heavy with smoke, and lamps began to glitter in a low forest of chimneys, and the widow crossed herself and said in Norwegian, "There is Chicago." The train pulled at last into a great long shed of iron and glass, all lit by gas jets, all echoing with the shriek of whistles and the shout of porters. She stepped down onto a stone platform with her wooden trunk on her shoulder and her small paper ticket still pinned to her coat, and she stood a long moment among the pushing crowd, tall and pale and freckled, looking for the face of a sister she had not seen in 7 years. Nellie found her first. A short round woman in a plain brown coat and a straw hat, elbowing through the porters, calling in Norwegian, "Brynhild, Brynhild, is it you?" They took each other's hands. They did not embrace. Nellie looked her sister up and down and shook her head and said only, "You are so big now," and Brynhild answered, "Yes, I am big." They walked out of the station into the roar of a Chicago evening. Horse cars clattered on iron rails down the middle of the street. Gas lamps burned in a long line on either curb. The sidewalks were of plank, warped and loose, and the gutters ran with a black slurry of manure and cabbage leaves. The buildings rose 4 and 5 stories, of dark red brick, their windows all yellow with lamplight. The air smelled of coal, of horses, of the stockyards to the south, of hot lard from the sausage kitchens, of the wet lumber piled along the branches of the river. Everything moved. Everything shouted. Brynhild walked beside her sister with her wooden trunk on her shoulder, and she said nothing at all, and her small pale eyes went from one thing to the next, taking the measure of each, as a cattle buyer at a fair takes the measure of a beast. Nellie's house was a narrow wooden thing on the west side of the city, 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, on a street of Norwegian and Swedish tradesmen. There was a kitchen with an iron stove, a parlour with a horsehair sofa, a bedroom above with a bed for the sister, and a small cot in the corner for Brynhild, and a Bible on a little table by the window. The husband, John Larson the carpenter, was a quiet man with sawdust in the cuffs of his trousers, and he shook Brynhild's hand once, gravely, and said in Norwegian only, "Welcome," and then went to bed. That first night Brynhild lay on the cot in the corner of the upper room, still in her dark dress and her stockings, her wooden trunk beneath her, and she listened to the strange sound of a city that never grew quiet. Somewhere, far off, a train whistle blew. Somewhere nearer, a drunk sang in the street. A horse's hoofs clopped past. A woman laughed. She lay awake a long time, and when at last she closed her eyes she saw, not the fjord and not the potato field, but a long counter in a shop, and a young shopkeeper with a soft blonde moustache, weighing sugar into a paper bag, smiling gently at a Norwegian widow across the wood, and she did not yet know his name. The first husband and the falling meat grinder. The morning after her arrival, Bella rose before the light. She had slept perhaps 3 hours. She washed her face at the tin basin in the kitchen, plaited her hair, put on her one clean apron, and stood at the window looking down into the narrow yard. A rooster was crowing somewhere over the fences. A milkman's wagon rattled past, drawn by a thin bay horse, the tin cans clashing together at every rut. Nellie came down the stairs in her wrapper and set the coffee pot on the stove. She poured out 2 cups of the black bitter drink and cut 2 thick slices of dark bread and put a small dish of butter and a smaller dish of sugar between them. She looked at her sister across the plank table, and said in Norwegian that a strong girl in Chicago could find work in a day if she wished it, and Bella nodded once and drank her coffee down. By the end of that first week, she was in service in a fine house on Ashland Avenue, in the west side of the city, working for a German family named Meissner, who kept a linen shop on Milwaukee Avenue. Her wages were $12 a month, with her room in the attic and her food at the kitchen table. She rose at 5, laid the fires, blacked the stove, drew the water from the pump in the yard. She scrubbed the front stoop with lye and a brush, hauled coal from the cellar in a hod, beat the parlour rugs on a line in the back garden. She learned to say bread and milk and meat and please and thank you in English. She learned to answer the door in a white cap and a white apron, and to curtsy slightly, and to lower her eyes when the master spoke. She saved every silver dollar she was paid, and put them into a small tin box beneath a loose board in the attic floor, the same tin box that had crossed the ocean. For 3 years she went from one place to another. She worked for a Norwegian doctor on Erie Street, for an Irish widow who kept a boarding house on Grand Avenue, for an American family in a stone house near Union Park. She learned the streets of the West Side by their smells before she learned them by their names. She learned that on Milwaukee Avenue the Norwegian bakers made a soft dark rye for 6 cents a loaf, that at the corner of Halsted and Chicago Avenue the Swedish butcher sold sausage for 9 cents a pound, that on Sundays the Norwegian Lutheran church on Erie Street filled with 200 worshippers in dark wool, singing the old hymns in the old tongue. She was seen there each Sabbath in a plain black dress, a hymn book in her broad hand, sitting near the back, her pale eyes fixed forward, her mouth moving with the words. The pastor, a stern man from Stavanger, took a liking to the tall pious girl from Selbu, and it was through that church, in the winter of the year 1883, that she was first introduced to a young shopkeeper named Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen. He was a small, neat man of about 28, with a soft blonde moustache and mild blue eyes, and hands that were always a little stained with sugar. He had come to America some years before from the town of Ålesund, on the west coast of Norway, and he had drifted through several trades before finding work as a clerk in a candy shop on Grand Avenue. He was thought a quiet, decent, careful man. He drank a little beer on Saturday nights, but never to excess. He kept his shirt stiff with starch and his boots polished with lampblack. He lived in a rented room above the shop, and he sent a few dollars every month to his mother in Norway. When he first saw Bella at the door of the church after the Sunday service, he took off his hat and bowed to her, and she looked at him a long moment before she nodded back. They were married in the spring of the year 1884, in the same Norwegian church on Erie Street. The bride wore a dress of dark wool she had made herself, with a small bit of white lace at the throat. The groom wore his one black suit and a stiff paper collar. There were perhaps a dozen guests, most of them from the shop and the church. Nellie stood beside her sister in a straw hat trimmed with a black ribbon, and John Larson stood beside Mads with his carpenter's hands folded stiffly at his waist. The pastor read the marriage lines in Norwegian. The organ wheezed a psalm. Bella signed the register in her round schoolgirl hand, Bella Paulson, and Mads signed beside her, M. D. A. Sorensen and the sexton dated the page in careful brown ink, and the two of them walked out into a mild May afternoon with rice thrown after them by the Meissner children, who had come along for the fun. They set up house first in a small flat above the candy shop on Grand Avenue, 2 rooms with a stove, a bed, a table, and a horsehair sofa Mads had bought second-hand for $4. The shop below was narrow and long. It had a wooden counter along one wall, with glass jars of hard candies set upon it in a bright row, red drops and yellow drops and green drops and black licorice, and behind the counter a small marble slab where Mads pulled taffy in the afternoons, his sleeves rolled up, sugar clinging to the fine hairs of his arms. He also sold penny newspapers and cheap cigars and, at Christmas, small tin toys from Germany. The rent for the shop and the flat together was $15 a month. Business was steady, not grand, and by careful reckoning, Mads made about $70 in a good month, of which nearly 20 went straight to the wholesaler for sugar, and the rest to rent and coal and flour and small pleasures. Bella took to the shop like a woman born to a counter. She learned to weigh sugar into paper twists, to reckon change in American cents, to speak to Norwegian mothers about their children and to Irish labourers about the weather. She swept the plank floor twice a day. She washed the glass jars every Saturday. She stood behind the counter in a clean white apron, her broad shoulders filling the space behind it, her pale eyes moving from face to face, and the customers, without quite knowing why, paid their pennies quickly and did not linger to chat. In the evenings, when the shop was closed, she cleaned the marble slab with a cloth of soft flannel until it shone, and she counted the day's takings in a small ledger she kept in a drawer, and she wrote each figure down twice, once in ink and once in pencil. There were no children at first, and then there were children, and the story of those children is one of the strange sorrows of that flat above the candy shop. Mads and Bella were said, in the church record and in the census of that year, to be the parents of several small ones over the course of the next years. There was a boy called Caroline, born about 1886. There was a boy called Asle, born about 1888. There was another child born a little later. Each of these small ones sickened and died in the flat above the shop, one after the other, of what the doctors of the time set down on the certificates as acute colitis or as inflammation of the bowels. Each of them was buried in a small pine coffin in the Norwegian section of the great Cook County cemeteries, and each of them had been insured, in a modest way, with a Norwegian benefit society, so that the payout on each little life came to a few $100s, enough to bury the child and to leave a little over. The Norwegian neighbours on Grand Avenue clucked their tongues and said that the summers in the flat were hot and the drains were bad, and Mads walked to work each morning with his eyes red from weeping, and Bella stood behind the counter and weighed the sugar with a steady hand. In time they took in a foster child, a little girl of Norwegian parents in Chicago who had died in the same season, and this child was called Jenny Olsen. She was small, dark-haired, quiet, and she followed Bella through the shop and the flat, with a wooden doll clutched under her arm. Bella did not smile at the child, but she fed her well and dressed her cleanly, and let her sit on a stool behind the counter in the afternoons, watching the taffy stretch on the marble. In the church at Erie Street on Sunday mornings, the little girl sat between them, and the Norwegian widows nodded and said what a Christian thing the Sorensens had done, to take a poor orphan in. In the year 1896, on a hot summer night, the candy shop on Grand Avenue burned. Mads was at a lodge meeting. Bella was in the flat upstairs with the child. She woke, so she said, to the smell of smoke and the crackle of flame, and she carried Jenny down the outside stair in her nightdress, and she stood on the pavement in her bare feet, and watched the fire eat through the wooden front of the store, while the neighbours came out with buckets. The fire company arrived at last with its steam pumper, drawn by 3 grey horses, and threw water on the smoking ruin. The stock of candy was lost. The marble slab was cracked in 3 places. The wooden counter was burned to charcoal. But the shop had been insured for a sum that turned out to be considerably more than the shop had been worth, and the insurance company, after some grumbling and some questions, and one visit from a small man with a notebook, paid the claim in full. With that money, Mads bought a wooden house on Alma Street, on the west side, and moved his small family into it. Bella opened a new little shop nearby, this one selling not candy, but confectionery of another kind, cakes and pies and small breads. But this shop too caught fire not long after, at night, when no one was in it, and this shop too had been insured, and this insurance too paid in due course. The neighbours on Alma Street began, very quietly, to speak of the Sorensens. It was a strange thing, they said, that so much bad luck should fall on one small family, that so many little coffins should be carried out, and so many small shops should burn. But the Sorensens were pious. They were seen in church. Mads was gentle. Bella was tall and stern, and paid her butcher in cash. There was no one in Chicago to look too closely at the small ledger she kept in her drawer. Life insurance was a new thing then, sold door to door by young men in bowler hats, and it was thought a modern and prudent thing for a working man to carry a policy on his life for the sake of his widow. By the spring of the year 1900, Mads Sorensen carried 2 policies on his own life. One had been taken out with the Norwegian Order of Mutual Aid some years before, in the amount of $2,000. The other was newer, from a large insurance company, in the amount of $3,500. Between them, if he died, they would pay out a sum of $5,500, more than a workingman on Grand Avenue could hope to see in a lifetime of labour. The premiums on both policies were paid faithfully by his wife, who sent the small drafts each month from her ledger in the drawer, and each month brought a receipt back from the postman and pinned it neatly on a hook in the kitchen wall. There came a day in July of that year, the 30th day of the month, a Monday, hot as only Chicago in high summer can be hot, the pavement soft under the wheels of the drays, the sky yellow with the smoke of the stockyards to the south. Mads had risen that morning complaining of a small pain at the back of his head. His wife had made him a cup of coffee and had told him to lie down on the horsehair sofa in the parlour. She had gone into the kitchen. In the kitchen she had, so she said afterward, prepared for him a dose of quinine powder, folded in a paper twist, for she believed he had a touch of a summer fever. She had brought it to him in a cup of water. She had watched him swallow it. He had closed his eyes. Within the hour he was dead. The family doctor, an old Norwegian man of the neighbourhood, was sent for. He came at once, still in his shirt-sleeves from a summer supper, and he looked at the small blond man on the horsehair sofa, and he pressed his ear to the man's chest, and he lifted an eyelid and looked at the pupil. He asked the widow what her husband had eaten that day. She told him. He asked whether her husband had complained of anything of late. She said only of a small pain at the back of his head. The old doctor knew, as all the neighbours knew, that Mads Sorensen had suffered for years from a weakness of the heart, and he wrote on the certificate that the cause of death was an enlargement of the heart, and he signed his name, and he took his fee of $2, and he went home to his supper. Mads Sorensen was buried 3 days later in the Norwegian section of Forest Home Cemetery, in a plain pine coffin with brass handles. The pastor from Erie Street preached the funeral in the small Lutheran chapel. The widow wore a black wool dress and a black bonnet with a heavy veil, and she stood at the graveside with the little girl Jenny beside her, and she did not weep once. Only her broad shoulders moved a little when the earth first fell upon the coffin lid. The Norwegian widows in the churchyard said afterward that Mrs. Sorensen bore her sorrow like a woman of iron, and the pastor patted her hand and told her that God was with her. Within the month, papers were filed at the offices of both insurance companies. There was a small unpleasantness with one of the clerks, who noticed that both policies had been in force on the same day, a rare thing, and who asked the widow 1 or 2 soft questions across a marble counter. She answered him in her low voice, her small pale eyes never leaving his face, and she produced the doctor's certificate, and she produced the receipts from the church, and the clerk in his stiff paper collar looked down at his ledger a long moment, and then wrote a small note in the margin, and signed the voucher. In due course 2 drafts were drawn on 2 large banks, and the widow presented them at a teller's window in a stone building on LaSalle Street, and she was paid, in bills and gold coins, a sum that came to more than $5,000. She walked out of that stone building into the afternoon sunlight of Chicago, with the money folded flat inside a small leather purse pinned to the inside of her bodice, and she stood a long moment on the pavement, looking neither to the right nor to the left, while horse cars rattled past, and newsboys shouted, and the smoke of the stockyards drifted up the length of LaSalle Street. In her mind she was already gone from that city. She was already standing on a wooden porch far to the east, on a country road 2 miles north of a small town in Indiana, and the wind off a distant lake was cool on her face, and the sandy soil beneath her feet was very deep, and very quiet, and very willing to hold whatever it was given to keep. The farm at Porte. The train that carried her east from Chicago that autumn was a slow one. It ran along the south shore of Lake Michigan, through the marsh country and the low sand hills, past the black smoke of the steel mills at Gary, past the wooden church spires of the little Norwegian farms in the Calumet region, past the freight yards where long lines of hopper cars sat loaded with soft coal from the mines of southern Illinois. The trip from the Dearborn Street station in Chicago to the depot at Porte took less than 3 hours in fair weather. She rode in a coach car with red plush seats, a wooden trunk at her feet, the small leather purse still pinned to the inside of her bodice, the little girl Jenny asleep against her arm. Her own two small daughters sat across from her, Myrtle, a serious child of about 4, Lucy, a plump babe of 2, both in clean pinafores she had sewn herself. She wore a black wool suit and a black straw hat, and she did not speak once through the whole run. She watched the flat brown fields of Indiana slide past the window, and she thought her own thoughts. Porte, in the year 1901, was a town of some 7,000 souls. It lay in a bowl of low farmland ringed by shallow lakes, a place first settled by Yankee farmers from the east, and later by Germans and Norwegians and a few Irish. The name meant, in the French tongue of the old trappers, the door, because the country there opened a wide gap between the thick forests to the north and the wet prairie to the south. The courthouse sat on a square of grass in the middle of town, built of red brick with a white cupola and a small round clock. Michigan Avenue ran east and west through the square, paved with brick, lined with 2-story storefronts of iron and stone. There was a bank at each corner. There was a roomly hotel on the north side, 3 stories of red brick, with a wide veranda where farmers took their coffee. There was a Fox opera house down a side street, where a travelling company played farce and melodrama for 25 cents a seat. Around the square the shops sold hardware and dry goods and coffins and pianos and threshing machines, and the great yellow wagons of the Roomley works, made in a long brick factory on the south side of town, rolled out onto the county roads with the name of the town painted in black on their sides. She stepped down from the train on a raw November afternoon in the year 1901, with the sky low and grey and a smell of coal in the air, and she was met at the depot by a man in a brown coat and a bowler hat, an agent of a Chicago land firm who had arranged the sale. He touched his hat and greeted her politely. He put her trunk on a spring wagon he had waiting, and he lifted the little girls one by one onto the plank seat, and he clucked to the 2 bay horses, and he drove her north through the streets of the town, past the courthouse square and the interurban tracks and the yards of the Lake Erie and Western, out along a country road that soon left the brick pavement and turned to hard clay, and then to sand, and then to the black gumbo mud that lay over so much of that county. The road they took was called McClung Road. It ran east from the north edge of the town, past a small dairy farm and a stand of second-growth oak, past a low wet pasture where a few gaunt Holsteins lifted their heads to watch the wagon go by. 2 miles from the courthouse, the road bent north for a short stretch, and there, on the east side, stood a plain wooden gate. The gate hung on iron hinges set in 2 heavy cedar posts, and it was flanked by a single row of hard maples that a former owner had planted 20 years before. Beyond the gate a straight lane ran east across a low rise. At the top of the rise stood the house. The place had been called by the neighbours the Altic place, for the woman who had held it last. Mattie Altic had been a Chicago woman of a certain reputation who had brought her money out from that city some years before and had bought the farm as a country retreat. She had died on the property, in her bed, of a natural cause, in the summer just past. Her heirs had wished to be rid of the place quickly, and it had been listed with the Chicago agent at a price of some $6,500 for the house, the outbuildings, and the 48 acres of tillable ground and orchard. The widow had answered the notice, had come out once in September to walk the fields with the agent, and had returned to Chicago with a quiet nod. Now she had come with her money. The house stood 2 stories tall, with a wide front porch that ran along the south and west sides. Its wooden siding had been painted some years past, a soft ochre yellow, and the paint had weathered to a pale sand colour that seemed to match the fields around it. The roof was of grey shingle. There were tall narrow windows on the front, 4 upstairs and 2 down, with black shutters. A single brick chimney rose from the centre of the roof, and a smaller stovepipe rose from the kitchen at the back. To the west of the house stood a small carriage house and a wood shed. To the north, back of a picket fence, ran a straight double row of apple trees and a shorter row of cherry trees, some 50 trees in all, with the last brown leaves still clinging to them in the November wind. Behind the orchard stood a red barn, and behind the barn stood a hog lot with a low board fence, and beyond the hog lot a small square outbuilding of plain plank, whitewashed once, set apart from the rest of the buildings, close to the pen. She stepped down from the wagon on the packed dirt of the yard, and she looked slowly around her. The wind moved the last of the maple leaves along the porch boards. A rooster called from somewhere behind the barn. The little girl stood close against her skirts, holding to the folds of her wool with small red hands. The agent unlocked the front door with a heavy iron key and led her inside. There was a small entry hall, with a coat hook on the wall and a strip of oilcloth on the floor. To the right lay a parlour with a horsehair sofa, an upright piano no one had tuned in a year, a small round stove of black iron, and a Bible on a little walnut table. To the left lay a dining room with a plain oak table and 6 chairs. Beyond the dining room ran a long kitchen, with a great cast-iron cook stove, a pump at the sink that drew from the yard well, a plank table scrubbed pale, and shelves stacked with the crockery of the former owner. A steep back stair rose from the kitchen to the second floor. There were 4 bedrooms upstairs, each with a plain iron bed frame, a washstand with a china pitcher and basin, and a small square window that looked out over the fields. Down a narrow set of steps from the kitchen ran the cellar. It was a wide, low room with a floor of hard-packed clay and walls of fieldstone. There was a coal bin along one side. There were shelves for jars of pickle and preserve. There was a small brick furnace and a bin for potatoes and a rack for the hanging of hams. The air smelled of damp earth and old smoke and, faintly, of the sweet lime the last owner had scattered on the floor before she died. The widow walked the length of the cellar slowly, her boots making small dry sounds on the clay. She looked at the low-beamed ceiling. She looked at the fieldstones set close together in the wall. She pushed the toe of her boot against the clay floor in one corner, and it gave a little under the pressure, soft and yielding, and she stood a long moment looking down. Outside, she walked the yard with the agent, who counted off the buildings for her. Barn, 28 by 40, ready for hay and horses. Smokehouse, 8 by 10, in good order. Carriage house, big enough for a light spring wagon and a buggy. Woodshed, with about a cord of split oak already stacked inside. Chicken house near the kitchen door, with a small run of wire netting. Hog lot to the north, with room for 40 pigs on good feed. Dug well at the front, 22 feet deep, with a windlass and a wooden bucket, sweet water. Cistern at the back for rain. Outhouse behind the smokehouse, dug over that year. She listened without a word. Then she turned toward the small square building at the edge of the hog lot. It was, the agent said, an old summer kitchen, though it had been used in later years for the keeping of tools and the storing of feed. Its plank walls had been whitewashed once and were now weathered grey. Its single door was of heavy oak with an iron latch. Its one small window was set high, no more than a foot square. Inside there was only a plank floor, a low bench along one wall, and a bin for corn. The widow stepped inside. She looked at the floor. She looked at the walls. She turned in a slow circle, her small pale eyes moving over every corner of the little building, and she said only, in her low voice, that it would do. She did not say for what. They returned to the house. In the parlour, on the walnut table by the Bible, the agent laid out the papers of the sale. The widow drew the small leather purse from the inside of her bodice. She counted out the money in bills and gold, slowly and twice, on the polished top of the table. The agent counted after her. When the count was right, she signed the deed with her round schoolgirl hand, Bella Sorensen, widow, of Chicago. The agent signed as witness. He wrote in his ledger the date, the 11th day of November, in the year 1901, and he folded the deed and put it into a leather case. He touched his hat to her once more, took his fee, and drove away down the sandy lane in the failing light, and the widow stood on the porch with the 2 small girls and the little foster child, and she watched his wagon shrink to a small dark speck against the November sky. That first night in the ochre house was very quiet. She lit a lamp in the kitchen and set a kettle on the stove. She made a porridge of oats and a little milk for the children. She washed their small faces with a warm cloth. She led them up the steep back stair to a single wide bed in one of the upstairs rooms, and she laid them down side by side, 3 heads on one long pillow, and she pulled a heavy quilt to their chins. She sat on the edge of the bed a long moment and did not speak. Downstairs she banked the stove for the night. She walked once around the parlour with the lamp in her hand. She stopped by the Bible on the walnut table and rested her broad palm upon it, and her lips moved a moment as if in a prayer, and no one saw whether it was a prayer or something else. In the days that followed she set to work with a will. She hired a Norwegian man from town, a wiry old carpenter named Olaf, to mend the barn door and rehang 2 of the porch shutters. She had the well cleaned and a new rope fitted to the windlass. She bought at the feed store on Michigan Avenue 6 shoats and a young sow, and had them driven out in a slat-sided wagon and turned into the hog lot behind the orchard. She bought a good milk cow, a red shorthorn, for $38. She bought a team of plain bay horses, a hen and a rooster, and a dozen laying hens, a light buggy for the church road, and a heavy farm wagon for the market. She paid for every one of these things in bills counted out slowly on a wooden counter, and every merchant on the square learned within a week that the new widow at the Altic place did not run a bill and did not ask a favour. The neighbours along McClung Road came, in the way of country neighbours, to call. They came in pairs, on Sunday afternoons, in their heavy wool coats, carrying small offerings, a jar of apple butter, a pound of fresh butter, a loaf of dark rye. She received them in the parlour. She served them coffee from a blue enamel pot, and small hard cakes she had baked in the great iron stove. She spoke of the weather, of the price of corn, of the sermon at the Norwegian church in town. She did not speak of Chicago. She did not speak of a candy shop on Grand Avenue, or of a horsehair sofa in a West Side flat, or of a small blonde man buried in a pine coffin in the Norwegian section of the great cemetery. When they rose to go, she stood at the door with the 2 little girls beside her and watched them walk down the lane to their wagons, and she waited until their wagons had turned onto McClung Road before she closed the door. Alone at night, when the children were asleep and the coals had settled in the stove, she sat at the plank table in the kitchen with a small ledger open before her. In one column she wrote the wages of the hired hand, and the price of coal, and the cost of the feed for the hogs. In another column she wrote what remained of the money from the 2 Chicago policies, which was still a great sum. And in a third column, at the bottom of the page, in a smaller, careful hand, she wrote a short list of Norwegian names. Some she crossed out lightly with a single line, keeping them still legible. Others she left plain. Beside a few she wrote a small figure in dollars, a rough estimate, perhaps, of what a lonely bachelor from a hard prairie might have saved up in a lifetime of small wages. She closed the ledger. She put it in a drawer. She snuffed the lamp. She listened, in the quiet of the ochre house on McClung Road, to the wind moving softly through the orchard, and to the low, restless sound of the hogs settling into their pen behind the barn, and beyond that, only to the great deep silence of 48 acres of sandy soil, waiting, in the November dark, to be used. Peter Gunness and the Sausage Stone. The winter of the year 1901 passed quietly on the farm at McClung Road. The widow tended her hogs and her hens. She drove her buggy to town on Saturdays for coffee and sugar and salt. She sat with her 3 small girls in the Norwegian church at Osborne Street on Sundays, in a black wool dress with a small brooch of jet at the throat, and she sang the hymns in a low, steady voice. The neighbours along the road said she was a strong woman, a pious woman, and a lonely one. A woman who had lost a good husband in Chicago, and who now turned 48 acres of sandy Indiana ground with her own 2 hands. There was no shame, they said, in such a woman looking about her for another man. A farm of that size was too much for a widow alone. A farm of that size wanted a strong pair of shoulders in the barn at dawn. Word of her, and of her farm, and of the small sum of money that had come with her out of Chicago, drifted west across the prairies through the pages of the Scandinavian. That Norwegian paper, printed in Chicago on Milwaukee Avenue, was read at every Norwegian supper table from Wisconsin to the Dakotas. Its back pages carried notices of every kind. A boy of Bergen sought a place with a farmer near St. Peter, Minnesota. A widow of Stavanger sought a housekeeper's post with a Christian family. A young man of sober habits, worth some $600, sought a wife of good character with means enough to buy a small farm together. In the early winter of that year, an advertisement of another kind appeared in those columns, small and plain, signed only with a box number at the Porte post office. It spoke of a Norwegian widow of small property, comely and Christian, seeking a hard-working Norwegian husband of steady trade. Answers, it said, should be sent to the box and should include a photograph and a statement of the writer's savings and prospects. Among the many Norwegian men who read that column in the winter kitchens of the West, one was a butcher in Janesville, Wisconsin, called Belle Gunness. He was a broad, dark-haired man of about 42, with heavy shoulders, thick red hands, and a soft, slow voice. He had come from Norway in his youth, and had knocked about the packing houses of Chicago before settling in Janesville, where he had opened a small shop of his own on a side street. He killed his hogs in a shed behind the store. He salted the pork in wooden barrels. He made a fine Norwegian sausage of ground pork and pepper and marjoram, which he sold for 10 cents a pound over the wooden counter to the Norwegian farm wives of the county. He was a widower. His first wife had died some months before, of no clear cause, in the small rooms above the shop, and had left him with 2 small daughters, a girl of 4 called Brynhild, and a baby not yet a year old called Jenny. His neighbours said he was a kind, plain, hard-working man, and that his heart was broken. He wrote to the box at the Porte post office in the middle of that winter. He wrote in a careful, careful hand, in Norwegian, on plain white paper he bought at the drugstore in Janesville. He said his name, his trade, his age, the value of his shop, and the small sum of some hundreds of dollars he had put by. He said he had 2 small daughters who wanted a mother's care. He said he was ready to sell his shop and to come east to any good Christian farm where a strong man's labour was wanted. He enclosed a small tin-type photograph of himself, taken in a studio in Janesville, showing a broad dark man in a black coat and a stiff collar, with a heavy dark moustache and mild sad eyes. He posted the letter with a 2-cent stamp and waited. The answer came within the week. It was written in the same round schoolgirl hand as a deed once signed on a walnut table, on a sheet of plain paper folded twice. It said that his letter had been read with prayer. It said that the widow had wept a little for his motherless children. It said that if he was in earnest, he should come to Porte in the early spring and see the farm for himself and speak with her face to face, so that a Christian union might be made in the sight of God and no man deceived. It was signed Bella Sorensen, and beneath the name she had written, in a smaller hand, the address of the farm on McClung Road. He came in the first week of April, in the year 1902. He came on the same slow train from Chicago that had brought her east that first November, dressed in the same black coat and stiff collar of his photograph, carrying a leather grip and a small wooden trunk. His 2 daughters came with him, sitting one on each side of him on the plush seat, the little Brynhild in a plaid dress and a knitted bonnet, the baby Jenny asleep against his heavy shoulder. He stepped down from the coach onto the plank platform at Porte in a soft spring rain, and he found the widow herself waiting for him beside a plain farm wagon drawn by 2 bay horses, a black shawl over her hair, her small pale eyes moving quietly over him from the top of his hat to the mud on his boots. They were married quietly 3 days later at the parsonage of the Norwegian church on Osborne Street on the first day of April. The pastor read the lines in Norwegian. There were no guests but the sexton and the sexton's wife. The bride wore her plain black wool with the small brooch of jet at the throat, and the groom wore his best black coat and a paper collar starched hard at the Janesville laundry. He signed the register in his careful, careful hand, Belle Gunness, butcher, of Janesville, Wisconsin. She signed beside him, Bella Sorensen, widow, of Porte. The date beside their names was set down in the church book in brown ink. When the little formality was done, they drove out along McClung Road together, the 2 small daughters wedged between them on the wagon seat, and the wooden trunk and the leather grip rolling behind them on the wagon bed, and they turned in at the wooden gate on the ochre house on the rise. and Peter Gunness of Janesville came home to the farm at Porte. For the first week, the farm seemed a good place to him. He rose before the light, as he had risen all his life, and he took to the work of the barn and the hog lot as a man born to it. He mended the sagging door of the smokehouse. He set new hinges on the gate. He walked the fence line of the orchard and marked the posts that needed replacing. In the evenings he sat at the long plank kitchen table with the widow and the 4 small girls, his Swanhild and his Jenny and her Myrtle and her Lucy, and he ate the heavy fried pork and the boiled potatoes and the black bread she set before him, and he drank his coffee slowly, and he thanked God, out loud, for the food. His broad red hands looked strange on the white plates. His mild, sad eyes moved often to the baby in the high chair beside him, who was Jenny, his own child, not yet a year old, and who reached for him with soft small fingers as he sat down. The baby died within a week of their coming to the farm. She was well one evening and dead in her cradle the next morning. The doctor from Porte, an old American named Beau Bowell, came out in his buggy and looked at the small, still body under the quilt, and he asked what she had eaten, and the widow answered, in her low voice, that she had eaten only the same soft porridge she had eaten for weeks past. Dr. Bowell felt the small forehead. He listened at the small chest. He straightened at last, and said that infants of that age often went suddenly, and that the will of God was a hard thing to read. He wrote on the certificate that the cause of death was an inflammation of the bowels. The little coffin was carried out to the same country cemetery 3 miles east, and the sexton dug a small grave beside a broken stone, and Peter Gunness stood beside the hole with his hat in his hand, and his heavy shoulders bowed, and his broad face was wet in the April wind. The widow stood beside him in her black wool dress with her small pale eyes on the middle distance, and she did not weep. He grieved for the child a long time. In the evenings at the plank table, his coffee cup grew cold in his hand. He spoke less. He put his heavy dark head into his heavy red hands and sat still for long minutes at a time. The widow did not press him. She kept the house scrubbed. She kept the shirts starched. She sent the older girls to bed at the proper hour. She sat across from him in the lamplight with her mending in her lap, and her small pale eyes watched him steadily above the moving needle, and when he lifted his face to hers, she gave him only the same low, quiet nod, as of one who understood without words. Summer came onto the flat fields of Porte County. The corn stood green and shoulder high. The orchard bloomed and the bees were loud in the apple trees. The hogs grew fat on the corn he ground for them in the small mill behind the barn. He worked from dawn to dusk in the fields. He came in at night with his shirt stuck to his broad back and the sweat running down the front of his throat, and he pumped a bucket of cold water at the yard well and washed himself in the kitchen doorway, and he ate whatever she set before him. He began, in the way of a hard-working man who is a widower no more, to grow easy again at the plank table. He began to speak of his old shop in Janesville, of the Norwegian farm wives who bought his sausage, of a small savings he had brought east that lay now in a Chicago bank, in the widow's name and his together. He spoke, once, of his life insurance. He carried a policy with the Norwegian Order of Mutual Aid for a modest sum, less than $1,000, and there was another, newer, in the name of a large company in Chicago, that he had allowed his new wife to take out on his life in the spring, in the amount of $2,500. He mentioned it plainly, in the way of a plain man, and she nodded across the table and said only that it was a wise Christian thing for a man with children to do. Autumn came, and the corn was cut, and the last apples were carried in from the orchard in wooden baskets. The nights grew cold. Frost lay white on the porch boards at dawn. In the smokehouse behind the ochre house he began to hang the hams and shoulders of the fall butchering, and the sweet oak smoke drifted low across the yard for days at a time. He was, at his own trade, a careful and patient man. He ground his sausage himself, in the long back kitchen, at a heavy iron machine bolted to the plank table. Beside the machine, on a wide wooden shelf above the stove, he kept the small heavy tools of his craft, an iron cleaver, a bone saw, a set of hooks, and, at the far end of the shelf, a heavy square of iron that he called the sausage stone, a solid black weight of some 7 or 8 pounds that he used to hold down the coarse cheesecloth over the barrels of curing meat. It sat there through the autumn, on the shelf above the stove, gathering a faint film of grease, watched by the widow every time she came into the kitchen to knead the bread. On a night in the middle of December of that year, the 13th or 14th day of the month, the wind was cold off the lake, and the sky was clear and hard. The children were asleep upstairs, 3 in one bed, 4 little heads on one long pillow. Peter Gunness came in from the smokehouse late, in his heavy sheepskin coat, and stamped the frost off his boots on the porch, and hung the coat on the hook in the entry, and sat down in his shirt sleeves at the plank table for a last cup of coffee before bed. The widow was at the stove. She was heating a pan of brine on the hot iron plate, a mixture, she said, for the pickling of a small tongue in the morning. The kettle sang on the back burner. The lamp on the plank table burned yellow and steady. He drank his coffee slowly. He spoke of a hog that had strayed through a gap in the fence that afternoon. He spoke of a letter he had written that day to his brother in Wisconsin. He said, once, that his little Jenny's face in the cradle in the spring still came to him at night, and he put his heavy hand across his eyes. What passed then in the kitchen no living soul saw except one. The widow's account, when she was pressed to give it, was that her husband bent down beside the stove to lace up a loose boot, and that at the same moment the pan of hot brine tipped from the plate and scalded him across the neck and the back of the head, and that in the same instant, from the shelf above the stove, the heavy square of iron that he called the sausage stone came suddenly loose, whether from a knock of her elbow, or a jar of the boiling pan, or the hand of Providence itself, and fell full onto the crown of his broad dark head, where it was bowed above the boot. He fell forward, so she said, without a cry, striking his temple upon the corner of the stove as he went down, and lay quite still upon the plank floor of the kitchen, in the yellow light of the lamp, while the brine steamed on his neck, and a slow dark ribbon ran from his ear across the pale scrubbed wood. She did not send for the doctor at once. She sent, instead, for a neighbour down the road, an older woman she trusted, and it was that neighbour's husband who drove into Porte in the cold small hours before dawn and roused Dr. Beau Bowell out of his bed with the news. Dr. Bowell came at once in his buggy, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat, and he stood a long time in the kitchen at McClung Road, with the lamp in his hand, looking down at the heavy square of iron on the floor beside the dead man, and at the small dark burn on the back of the neck, and at the shape of the wound that had opened the top of the skull, and at the pale face of the widow standing in the doorway in her black shawl with her small pale eyes fixed steadily on his own. He said nothing at once. He straightened up. He closed the dead man's eyes with 2 thick red fingers. He walked slowly around the plank table, looking at the shelf above the stove, and at the height of the shelf above the floor, and at the way the sausage stone had lain, and at the way the pan of brine had fallen, and at the doorway to the entry where her 3 children slept upstairs. When he turned back to her at last, his old face was grey and set. He said, in a low, even voice, that he would report the matter to the coroner in the morning, and that there would be, as the law required in such a sudden death, an inquest at the courthouse in the town, and that until such time as that inquest was held, the body should not be moved, and the kitchen should not be scrubbed. Outside the ochre house, in the cold December dark, the wind moved once through the orchard, and the hogs behind the barn stirred in their pen, and the sausage stone lay on the plank floor where it had fallen, waiting for the first grey light of the winter morning to come across the fields and find it there. The Matrimonial Advertisements. The inquest was held 3 days later, in a small room on the 2nd floor of the courthouse in Porte. The coroner was a heavy man named Charles S. Mac, and he sat behind a plain oak table with a ledger open before him. 6 men of the town were sworn in as the coroner's jury. They were farmers and shopkeepers in dark wool suits, called from their supper tables that Tuesday morning, and they sat in a half-circle of hard chairs and listened. Dr. Beau Bowell spoke first. He said what he had seen in the ochre house on McClung Road. He said the wound at the top of the skull. He said the burn upon the neck. He said the heavy square of iron on the floor. He spoke slowly and clearly, and he did not once look at the widow. She sat at the far end of the room in her plain black wool. Her broad hands rested folded in her lap. Her small, pale eyes moved from face to face along the row of jurors, and she did not weep. When her turn came, she spoke in her low, steady Norwegian voice, and a Norwegian interpreter carried her words across to the jury in careful English. She told them of the pan of brine on the hot iron plate. She told them of the sausage stone on the shelf above the stove. She told them her husband had bent to lace his boot. She said, once, that she had been in the parlour when she heard the fall, and that she had run to the kitchen to find him already still upon the floor. Her account had shifted a little from the words she had first given to Dr. Bowell, but the coroner's jury did not press her. She was a widow with 3 small girls upstairs, and now a 4th, the little Swanhild, sitting on a bench in the hallway, swinging her feet in wool stockings that did not reach the floor. Old Dr. Bowell had spoken privately to the coroner before the inquest opened. He had said, in a low voice in the hallway, that the wound was not the wound of a stone that had fallen from a shelf, but the wound of a stone that had been swung. He had said that the burn on the neck was too small for a full pan of brine. The coroner had listened, and had nodded, and had thanked him. The coroner had then spoken to the jury, and had reminded them that a hard finding against a Christian widow was a heavy thing to lay upon a household of orphans. The jury had gone into a smaller room. They had come out within the hour. Their verdict was written in the ledger in the coroner's careful brown ink. The death of Peter Gunness was found to have come by accident through the fall of a heavy iron weight from a kitchen shelf, and no blame was laid at any door. Peter Gunness was buried the next morning in Patton Cemetery, 3 miles east of the Ochre house. The Norwegian pastor from Osborne Street read the lines over the grave in his own tongue. A cold wind moved across the flat brown fields. His brother had come down from Wisconsin on the night train and stood at the head of the grave with his hat in his hand, and looked once at the widow and did not speak. The little Swanhild stood by her stepmother, in a black wool coat too big for her shoulders, holding to the folds of the widow's skirt. When the earth had closed upon the coffin, the mourners walked back to their wagons in silence. The widow drove home along McClung Road with the child on the seat beside her, and the reins loose in her broad hands, and her small pale eyes fixed on the road ahead. Within the month, the papers were filed with the insurance offices in Chicago. The Norwegian Order of Mutual Aid paid its modest sum, with only a small delay. The larger company paid its $2,500 in the first week of February, in a bank draft made out in the widow's name. She rode the interurban into town on the day the draft came, and she walked to the First National Bank on Michigan Avenue, and she cashed the draft at the teller's window. She folded the bills into the small leather purse she still carried pinned to the inside of her bodice. She walked out onto the brick pavement of Michigan Avenue in her black wool dress, and she stood a moment in the winter sun, and she counted the money in her mind once more, and she did not smile. That spring, the little Swanhild was sent back to her people in Wisconsin. Peter Gunness's brother came again on the train and took the child home to Janesville, and there she grew up among her father's kin, and there she lived out a long, ordinary life, and she was not seen again on McClung Road. The widow kept the Ochre house, and the orchard, and the barn, and the hog lot, and the small square outbuilding beside the pen. She kept her own 2 girls, Myrtle now 6, and Lucy now 4. She kept the foster child, Jenny Olson, now a serious child of a little more than 9, who slept in a small bed at the foot of the widow's own. In the summer of that year the widow was delivered of a son, born in the upstairs bedroom above the parlour, and she called him Philip. She had, so she told the neighbours, wished to name him after his father, but the neighbours did not know for certain which father she had meant. She was, by then, a woman near 40 years of age. She was heavier than she had been in Chicago. Her broad shoulders had grown broader. Her waist had thickened. Her pale face had settled into a kind of stern quiet, and her small blue eyes rested longer now upon each face they met. She wore her greying blonde hair pulled back into a plain knot at the nape of her neck. She wore black wool by day and white cotton by night. She kept the Ochre house scrubbed. She kept the orchard pruned. She hired her hands in 2s and 3s for the heavy work, and she paid them in cash from the small leather purse, and she did not run a bill at any shop in Porte. But the farm was still too much for one woman. The winter of 1903 came in hard across the flat Indiana ground. The pump at the yard well froze twice in January. A limb of the largest maple by the gate cracked in a February storm and lay across the lane for a week before a hired hand could be found to saw it up. The hogs, in their pen behind the orchard, grew thin on poor feed. The widow sat by the kitchen stove in the long evenings with her small ledger open before her, and she reckoned the price of coal and the price of oats, and the price of the small candles she burned in the parlour on Sunday nights. She reckoned also, in a colder column, the slow, steady melting of the sum she had brought out of Chicago, and the sum she had drawn from the second bank draft that February. Money went out of the ochre house more quickly than it came in. A farm of 48 acres wanted more than one strong pair of shoulders, and the shoulders it had were beginning to want another set beside them. She began to think again of the Scandinavian. She had watched it come to the ochre house every week for 2 years now, folded in brown paper, brought by the rural postman in his light spring wagon. She read it slowly at the plank table by the kitchen stove, tracing the columns with her broad finger. She read the notices at the back. Wanted, a good Norwegian girl for general housework in Minneapolis. Wanted, a strong man of the Lutheran faith to keep a small dairy in Iowa. Wanted, a wife of Christian character with a little property, for a farmer of Wisconsin, 40 years of age, of sober habits. The paper was full of such notices. The lonely men of the Norwegian prairies wrote them, and other lonely people answered them, and the paper took its small fee for the printing and asked no questions of any writer. In the spring of the year 1905, the first of her own notices appeared in the columns of the Scandinavian. It ran, in plain Norwegian, about 6 lines, on the back page beneath a notice for a rupture cure. It said that a widow of comely appearance and thrifty habits, the owner of a fine 48-acre farm in northern Indiana, wished to make the acquaintance of a Norwegian gentleman of similar means, with a view to the joining of 2 properties in Christian marriage. The widow was, so the notice said, a Christian woman of quiet ways and sound health. The gentleman must be sober, industrious, and free of debt. He must bring with him no less than $1,000 in cash to prove his good faith, and to be used, together with the widow's own property, in the paying off of a small mortgage that lay upon her fine farm. Answers were to be sent to a box at the Porte post office, and were to include a photograph and a full statement of the writer's savings. There was no mortgage upon the farm. The deed at the courthouse showed the property held clear. But no reader in North Dakota knew that, and no reader in Wisconsin was likely to travel the length of the country to look. The notice ran for 4 weeks. It was answered by more than a dozen men. Similar notices were placed in the Decorah Posten of Iowa, and in another Norwegian paper printed in Minneapolis, and later still in a small paper printed for the Norwegian trade in Chicago. Each notice carried the same box number at the LaPorte post office. Each notice asked for the same statement of savings. Each notice hinted, in the same careful phrasing, at a widow of comely appearance and a small mortgage that a good Christian husband might help to lift. The letters began to come to the ochre house on McClung Road by the dozen and then by the score. The postman drove them out in his light wagon with the mail from the town, and the widow met him at the porch and took the bundle from his hand and thanked him in her low voice. She read the letters at night at the plank kitchen table, with her small ledger open beside her and a lamp burning yellow above the wood. She read them slowly, one by one, in Norwegian and in the broken English of men who had left the old country in their youth. She read of small dairies in Wisconsin sold for $1,100, and of small stump farms in Minnesota sold for $7. She read of savings kept in old tobacco tins under the floorboards of lonely cabins. She read of nephews and nieces in the old country who would not be told. She read of widowers whose wives lay in country graves and whose small children lived with married sisters in distant towns. Some letters she folded and set aside without a mark. Others she copied out into a smaller book she kept in the drawer beneath the ledger, writing down the name, the town, the trade, the sum of savings, and the age of the writer, all in her round schoolgirl hand. Beside a few of these she drew a small star. The starred names were of men whose savings were largest, whose kin were fewest, and whose towns were farthest from LaPorte. She answered these first, Her letters back to them were written in the same round hand upon plain white paper. They were, so the men who received them said afterward, warm letters full of Christian feeling and small kindnesses of speech. She wrote of the beauty of the orchard in the spring. She wrote of the sweetness of the well water. She wrote of the fine two-story house and the wide front porch and the mild climate of northern Indiana. She wrote of the small mortgage and of the great blessing it would be to a lonely woman if a good Christian man would come and help to lift it, and to share the fruit of the sandy soil with her and her 3 small children. She wrote, in every letter, of one small thing above all. She warned the man not to speak of his intended journey to any of his neighbours for fear of gossip. She warned him not to trust his money to any bank in his own town, but to draw it out in bills and gold, and to bring it with him in his coat, sewn into a small pouch of oilcloth against the inside of the lining, where no thief upon a train could reach it. She warned him to send her a telegram from Chicago on the morning he would arrive at Porte, so that she might meet him at the depot with her plain farm wagon and drive him out to the ochre house on McClung Road, where he would be introduced to her 3 small children and shown the fine 48 acres and given a bed under a clean quilt in the upstairs room above the parlour. Man after man read these letters at his kitchen table on the western prairies. Man after man walked into his small country bank on a Saturday morning and drew out his savings in bills and gold. Man after man carried the money home wrapped in a handkerchief in the inside pocket of his coat. Man after man sat by his kerosene lamp in the evening with a needle and a length of oilcloth, and sewed a small pouch inside the lining of his best black jacket, and slid the money into it and stitched it closed. Man after man wrote his last letter to a sister in the old country, or to a nephew in a distant state, saying only that he was going east to be married to a fine Norwegian widow with a good farm in Indiana, and that they should not worry if his letters ceased for a while, because he would be busy at first with the new life. Man after man walked to his small country depot on a cold morning, and boarded a train for Chicago, and from Chicago boarded another train that ran east along the south shore of Lake Michigan, past the marshes and the steel mills, into the flat brown country of northern Indiana, toward the plank platform at Porte, where a tall, broad woman in a black wool coat and a small black bonnet stood waiting beside a plain farm wagon drawn by 2 patient bay horses, her small pale eyes moving quietly over each face that stepped down onto the platform, weighing it and measuring it, and calling it, with a low and Christian voice, by its name, the Suitors who never wrote home. The first of them stepped down from the coach on a bright September morning in the year 1905. His name was John Moe. He was a farmer's son from Elbow Lake, in Grant County, Minnesota, a broad, quiet man of 33 years, with a red beard and hands stained brown from the harvest. He had answered the widow's notice in the Scandinavian that August. He carried in the lining of his black wool coat, sewn there by his own patient stitches, $1,000 in banknotes and gold pieces. He wore his one good hat and a stiff paper collar, and his best boots blacked with lamp black. In his leather grip he carried a change of shirts, a razor, a shaving mug, and a small tin frame with a picture of his mother in Norway. The widow met him at the plank platform in Porte, in her black wool coat and her small black bonnet. She smiled once at him, a small brief smile, and shook his hand, and led him to the farm wagon. She drove him out along McClung Road in the mild autumn air. She spoke to him softly of the orchard, of the price of hogs that year, of the Norwegian church on Osborne Street. He sat beside her on the plank seat and answered her in his slow, careful Norwegian, and he looked about him at the flat brown fields and the last green corn, and he thought that a man could do worse than this. For 3 days he was seen in Porte. He walked with the widow into the First National Bank on Michigan Avenue on the Monday morning, and he stood at the teller's window in his one good hat while she spoke of a small mortgage that must be paid off soon. He drew from the lining of his coat, in a small side room of the bank, a thick roll of bills, and he laid them upon a marble counter, and he counted them once, and she counted them after him. The teller counted them a 3rd time and gave a receipt, and the widow folded the receipt into her small leather purse and pinned it inside her bodice, and John Moe and his empty coat lining walked out into the September sun with her, and climbed onto the plain farm wagon and drove east out of town. He was never seen again by any man in Porte. His letters back to Elbow Lake, which he had promised his brother would come in a fortnight, did not come. His brother wrote a letter that October to the address on McClung Road, asking after him. A reply came in the widow's round schoolgirl hand. It said, in warm Christian phrases, that John Moe had come to the farm, had looked over the property, and had not, in the end, felt the calling to marriage in a place so far from his own kin. He had drawn his money out again, and had gone west, so she said, to the copper country of Michigan, where he had spoken of taking a position with a mining company. She was sorry, she said, to give the brother no better word. She hoped that when John wrote at last from the north, he would forgive her for having, however briefly, hoped to be his wife. The brother read the letter twice at his kitchen table in Elbow Lake, and folded it, and put it in a drawer, and waited, and no other letter ever came. That winter and the spring after, one man and then another followed the same track. There was Ole B. Budsberg, an older Norwegian widower of Iola, Wisconsin, who had sold his small dairy farm for a little over $1,000 and had come east in April of 1907 with the money in the lining of his coat. He was a grey man of some 50 years, with a kind blue eye and a soft, slow way of speaking. His 2 grown sons watched him board the train at the small country depot, and asked him again whether he was quite sure of this widow he had never met, and he had smiled at them and had said that a Christian man must trust a Christian woman. He arrived at Porte on the 5th of April. He was seen at the courthouse that afternoon with the widow at his side, signing a paper with a steel pen, drawing money from a small bank draft at the First National, walking back to the farm wagon in his one good coat and his soft hat. His sons in Iola waited for a letter. They waited through May, through June, through the whole summer of that year. They wrote to Porte twice and got back twice the same warm Christian phrases. Ole had come and had gone. Ole had drawn his money and had gone west. Ole had spoken, in his last conversation on the porch, of the wheat country of the Dakotas. The sons closed their father's letters into a small bundle and set them upon a shelf, and every year at Christmas they took them down and looked at them again, and every year the shelf grew a little more dusty. There was Ole Olsen Lindboe of Chicago, and there was Christian Hilkven of Dover, Wisconsin, and there was Herman Konitzer of Chicago, and there was a Norwegian carpenter from Minneapolis, who was written of in later years, but whose name in the county papers cannot now be quite made out. There was John Anderson, a farmhand from Chicago, and there was another Norwegian widower who had come by way of the Dakotas, and there was still another who had come from a little town in southern Wisconsin whose depot was so small that the ticket agent remembered the man's face for years afterward, and remembered too that the man had bought his ticket on a Saturday in the winter in his best black coat, with his savings in the lining. Each of these men wrote his last letters home before he came. Each of these men warned his kin not to worry if his letters ceased for a time. Each of these men bought a one-way ticket to LaPorte, Indiana. Each of these men, so the widow's letters back to their kin later declared, had come and had inspected the farm, and had, in the end, decided against the marriage, and had drawn his money out again, and had gone west, or south, or into the Michigan copper country, or into the wheat country of the Dakotas, or into the timber country of Washington state, and had not been heard from since. The letters back to the widow, from the sisters and the brothers and the sons of these vanished men, were folded quietly into a small tin box she kept in the drawer beneath her ledger. The photographs the men had sent of themselves, in stiff black coats and paper collars, standing before painted backdrops of country landscapes in the studios of small prairie towns, were kept in a second tin box in the same drawer. She looked at them sometimes in the yellow light of the kitchen lamp. She did not seem to see the faces. She seemed to see, past the faces, the small hard sums of dollars each face had once carried in the lining of its coat. The hogs in the pen behind the orchard were fat that year. They had been fat, in truth, every year since she had come. The neighbours along McClung Road said the widow had a way with hogs. She fed them well. She fed them scraps that no other farm produced. She was seen in the yard at all hours with buckets in her broad hands, buckets that she carried herself from the kitchen door, past the smokehouse, past the small square outbuilding by the pen, to the low board fence. She would empty each bucket over the fence with a slow, steady motion. The hogs would come running at the sound of her step, their pink noses lifted, their small dark eyes bright. She would stand a moment above them in the wind, watching them press against one another for the food, and then she would turn and go back to the kitchen with her empty buckets, and she would not look behind her. In the small square outbuilding by the pen, a new floor of thick oak plank had been laid in the spring of the year 1906. A neighbour's boy who had helped to lay it, at the widow's asking, said years afterward that she had wanted the boards close together and heavy, so that the corn she meant to store on them would not sift down into the sand beneath. Beneath the plank floor, no man was allowed to look. The widow kept the door of the little building locked with a padlock of iron, and she wore the key upon a plain string around her neck, beneath her collar, and no man had reason to think it strange, for a countrywoman with a farm to run had many small buildings that she alone might use. At the northern edge of the hog lot she had, in the autumn of the year 1906, ordered a hired man to dig a long shallow trench, some 10 feet by 4, along the fence line. She had told him it was for the burying of a heap of old refuse, dead hens and rotted apples and the sweepings of the barn. She had told him to dig it deep. When the trench was ready, she had sent him home for the day, and had paid him for his work, and had told him she would fill it herself, in her own time. The hired man had gone. In the days that followed, other trenches, smaller and shorter, appeared in other corners of the yard, close to the smokehouse, close to the outhouse, close to the picket fence that ran between the orchard and the road. Each of them was in time filled in, and the earth stamped down, and a scattering of dry corn husks and old straw thrown across the top, so that a man walking through the yard in the pale winter sun would see only a farm as any other, and would think no more of it. In town they knew nothing of these trenches. They knew only that the widow came in on Saturdays for her sugar and her salt and her coffee, that she paid in cash from her small leather purse, and that her 3 children were quiet and clean at the Norwegian church on Osborne Street. They knew that she had grown, in the last 3 years, a little heavier and a little slower in her walk, and that her small pale eyes rested longer now upon each face that spoke to her. They knew that she kept, from time to time, a hired hand, a Norwegian named Ray Lamphere, a slim young man of about 37, whose face had grown pinched with drink, and whose hands trembled when he counted out coins for a small glass of whiskey at the saloon on Detroit Street. They knew that this Ray Lamphere had once been her hand for a full year, and had left her service, and had come back, and had left again, and that the last of these partings had been an angry one, with hard words exchanged upon the porch of the ochre house, and with the widow herself walking to the town constable to complain that her former hand was watching her from the road at night. The neighbours along McClung Road saw the trunks come and the trunks go. They saw a big wooden trunk unloaded at the plank platform of the depot on a Wednesday afternoon and carried out to the farm on the widow's plain wagon, and they saw no man ever walk down that lane again to catch a train back to the west. They saw a heavy carpet bag of the sort that a man of small property might carry, brown leather bound with brass, sitting on the porch of the ochre house on a hot summer morning. They saw it disappear from the porch by the next day. They saw the smoke of the widow's kitchen chimney rise a little heavier for a week at a stretch, and the smoke of her smokehouse hang low along the yard, and the trees of the orchard drop their fruit in the autumn onto sandy ground that seemed each year to grow a little darker in patches, and a little softer in patches, and to yield each spring a slightly ranker green. Rumour stayed inside the ochre house and behind the picket fence. Only once did it walk out to the road. In the summer of the year 1907, a farmer named John Nicholson, who lived on the section next to the widow's, was crossing his own field one August morning at first light, when he saw, through a gap in the picket fence, the widow at work in the hog lot beyond her barn. She was in a heavy apron, with a broad, flat shovel in her hands, and she was moving the sandy soil about in a shallow pit near the corner of the fence. The sun was not yet full up. There was a mist upon the low ground. Nicholson did not stop to watch her long. He was a Christian man, and it did not do to spy upon a neighbour at her farm work. He walked on, but he told his wife of it at breakfast, and his wife told her sister at the Wednesday sewing circle in town, and the sister told, some months later, another neighbour, who told the story again to a woman at a church supper, and in this way, very slowly, through the winter of that year and the spring of the year 1908, the small thin thread of talk moved through Porte. Widow Gunness dug in her yard at strange hours. Widow Gunness had a way with hogs. Widow Gunness had lost, over the years, more suitors from the West than any other Christian woman in Indiana. Still no man in Porte thought to write to the sheriffs of the little prairie towns and ask whether their missing farmers might be found buried beneath a hog lot on McClung Road. Still no man in Wisconsin thought to travel east to see with his own eyes the ochre house where his brother had gone to seek a wife. Still the letters kept coming to the box at the Porte post office, from lonely widowers in Iowa, in Minnesota, in North and South Dakota, in the copper country of Michigan, in the timber camps of Washington. Still the small leather purse pinned inside the widow's bodice grew heavier each season with the folded notes of men who had trusted a Christian phrase upon a printed page. Only in the winter of 1907 and 1908, in a small farmhouse in Mansfield, South Dakota, did a thin, quiet man named Asle Helgelien begin to sit late at his own kitchen table in the yellow light of his own lamp, reading and rereading the last letters his brother Andrew had sent him from Porte. He read the letters until the paper was soft at the folds. He read them until he knew each careful line by heart. He wrote to the widow at last, again and again through the cold winter, and the widow's answers came back in her round schoolgirl hand, patient, Christian, unhurried, telling him that Andrew had come and had drawn his money and had gone west to Chicago and had spoken of a business venture in the state of Oregon and was surely well and would surely write soon. Asle Helgelien read these letters at his kitchen table by the yellow lamp. He looked out through his frosted window at the flat white prairie beyond his door. He did not believe her. He wrote, once, a short quiet letter that said only that if he did not hear from Andrew by the spring, he would come himself to Porte, and he would look for his brother in whatever place upon that farm he might have gone. He posted the letter on a Saturday morning in March of the year 1908, and beyond the far edge of the flat brown fields of northern Indiana, the earth on McClung Road began, though it did not yet know it, to count out the last of its long, silent days. Asle Helgelien and the fire. The winter had not been kind to Asle Helgelien. It had been long and heavy across the flat white ground of Mansfield, South Dakota, with drifts to the eaves of the barn and a wind that did not let up for weeks at a time. He was a thin man of about 50, with a narrow face and a short brown beard already grey at the chin. He kept a small wheat and cattle place on the prairie, and he lived alone, and he read his Bible every night at a plank table in a low log house that smelled of coffee and coal smoke. His brother Andrew had lived only a few miles from him, on a similar small place, until the autumn just passed. Andrew was a broad, quiet man, a bachelor of 49, careful with his money. He had sold off his cattle in October. He had sold his farm in December. He had walked into the small bank at Aberdeen and had drawn out his savings, near $3,000 in bills and gold. He had shown Asle the money in a leather pouch by lamplight in the kitchen of the log house. He had said he was going east to marry a fine Norwegian widow with a good farm in Indiana. Asle had begged him not to go. Andrew had smiled his slow smile. He had gone. The last letter from Andrew had come from Porte on the 3rd of January, in the year 1908. It was short. It said only that he had arrived safely, that the widow was a good Christian woman, and that he would write again within the week. He had not written again. Asle had waited a week. He had waited a month. He had written to the widow at the address on McClung Road. Her answer had come back in a round schoolgirl hand, warm and Christian and unhurried. Andrew had come. Andrew had grown restless. Andrew had drawn his money out again and had spoken of a mining venture in the state of Oregon. Andrew had gone west. Asle had read the letter twice by the yellow lamp and had folded it and had set it in the drawer, and he had not believed one word of it. He wrote to her again in February. He wrote to her again in March. Her replies came each time in the same warm phrasing, telling him not to fret, telling him that Andrew was a grown man of steady habits and would surely write when he was settled. Asle read them at his table each night. He read the older letters too. He laid them side by side on the plank wood, and he studied the way one line answered a question he had asked, and the way another line said nothing at all. He was not a clever man, but he was a stubborn one, and he loved his brother, and he could see, plain as the frost on his window, that something was not right in the ochre house on McClung Road. In the middle of March he wrote her a different kind of letter. He said that if Andrew was not heard from by the spring, he himself would come to Porte and would look for his brother in whatever corner of that farm he might be. He posted the letter on a cold Saturday morning at the small country store, and he watched the mail wagon carry it away across the white prairie, and he went home and sat by his stove and waited. The widow's answer to that letter was different. It came within the week. It was longer than the others. It urged him not to trouble himself. It said Andrew had certainly gone west. It said that a journey to Porte would only bring him grief and cost. It ended with a small, strange line that Asle read twice. She wrote that if he must come, he should not come until she had sent for him, for she wished to be at her ease when he arrived, and to have all things ready. He set the letter down slowly. He looked at it a long time. He did not answer. Through April he made his plans. He wrote to the ticket agent at Aberdeen and asked the fare east. He drew his own small savings from the country bank. He wrote to a cousin in Chicago and asked him to expect him at the Dearborn Street station in the first week of May. He sharpened his pocket knife on a small whetstone and put it in his coat. He did not tell his neighbours where he was going. He told only the pastor at the little Norwegian church, who blessed him at the church door on a Sunday morning, and said that God's ways were hard to read but never dark to him. 2,000 miles east of Mansfield, in the ochre house on McClung Road, the last week of April came in warm and green. The apple trees in the small orchard were in bud. The cherry trees behind the picket fence were already dropping their small white petals across the grass. The hogs in the pen behind the barn were fat on winter feed, their pink sides steaming in the mornings when the frost still held. The widow had, for weeks now, been much in town. She had gone into the First National Bank on Michigan Avenue on the 27th of April, a Monday, and had drawn a small sum of cash. She had gone into a lawyer's office in the courthouse square and had signed a paper, a will, in which she left her 3 children her whole estate and named an old Norwegian pastor from Chicago as their guardian. She had gone into a hardware store on Lincoln Way and had bought 2 gallons of kerosene in a tin can with a red-painted top. She had carried the can herself out to the plain farm wagon and had set it beneath the seat and had driven north along McClung Road in the mild spring wind. The clerk at the hardware store thought nothing of it. Every farm in the county bought kerosene by the tin. She had also, in those last weeks, been much afraid. That much was seen. She had told her banker, in the small side room of the First National, that her old hired hand, Ray Lamphere, had threatened to burn her out. She had told the town constable the same. She had told the pastor at Osborne Street the same. She had sworn out a complaint against Lamphere, and had gone before a justice of the peace, and had said that the slim young Norwegian meant to kill her and her 3 children in their beds. The justice had shaken his head and had not held Lamphere over, because the widow could show no bruise and no note. But her tale ran along the porches of McClung Road. Widow Gunness feared her old hand. Widow Gunness slept with her lamp burning low. Widow Gunness had told her banker only the week before that if she came to any sudden end, the country was to look first to Ray Lamphere. The new hired hand that spring was a man named Joe Maxon. He was an American of about 30, of quiet ways, who slept in a small back room on the north side of the ochre house, with a plank door that opened on the steep back stair. He rose at 4 each morning to feed the horses. He ate his breakfast at the plank table in the kitchen at 5:30, with the widow moving quietly about the stove in her long apron, and her broad shoulders, and her small pale eyes. He had been with her only a few weeks. He liked her cooking, and did not question her ways. On the evening of the 27th of April, the widow was seen once more in the yard by the picket fence, standing with a bucket in her broad hand, feeding scraps to the hogs. She was singing softly under her breath. Joe Maxon passed her on his way to the barn and touched his cap. She nodded at him and did not stop her singing. That night at supper she was quiet. She sent the 3 children early to bed. She stood a long time in the parlour before the little walnut table where her Bible lay, and she rested her broad palm upon the black leather, and her lips moved once as if in a prayer, and Joe Maxon, passing the parlour door on his way to his small back room, did not see her face. He fell asleep quickly, as tired working men do. The wind moved gently through the maples by the gate. The lamps in the front windows of the ochre house were snuffed one by one. Only the kitchen light lingered a while, a soft square of gold on the porch boards, and then that too went dark. In the small hours of the morning of the 28th of April, in the year 1908, Joe Maxon woke to the smell of smoke. It was in the walls. It was in the plank floor beneath his cot. He sat up and swung his bare feet down and touched wood that was warm to the touch. He struck a match. The room was full of a thin grey haze that moved along the ceiling like a low tide. He shouted for the widow. He shouted for the children. He got no answer. He pulled on his trousers and his boots, and he threw open the plank door onto the steep back stair, and the stair was a chimney of orange fire, roaring up from the kitchen below. He shut the door again. He turned to his one small window. He kicked out the glass with the heel of his boot, and he crawled through the small square opening and dropped onto the wet grass in his shirt sleeves and one suspender loose. He ran around the ochre house shouting. He saw flames now in every downstairs window, moving in the parlour curtains, licking along the porch rail. He ran to the yard well and pumped a bucket of water and threw it at the porch. It did nothing. He ran to a neighbour down the road, William Clifford, and he beat on the door and shouted that the Gunness house was burning and that the widow and her 3 children were still inside. Clifford came out in his nightshirt and his boots. Other neighbours came. A young man rode into La Porte on a bareback horse and roused the fire company. The steam pumper was brought out at the trot behind 3 grey horses, its brass boiler glowing, its bell ringing across the sleeping town. It reached McClung Road as the first pale line of dawn came up over the flat brown fields. By then the ochre house was already lost. Its roof had fallen in. Its 4 tall front windows were only squares of red fire. Its wide porch had collapsed onto itself in a heap of glowing timber. The paint had blistered off the wooden siding of the north wall, and the wall itself was burning through. The firemen turned their hose upon the ruin as best they could. Water hissed and rose in white steam from the black rafters. Neighbours stood in a wide, silent circle in the wet grass, their faces orange in the light of the fire, their eyes fixed on the upstairs windows where the 4 heads had lain on their pillows the night before. No one came to the windows. No one screamed inside the walls. Only the fire spoke in its long, low roar, and only the great brick chimney stood at last above the black heap when the roof was gone, holding up nothing but the pale sky. By full daylight the fire had eaten itself out. Only the fieldstone foundation was left, and the brick chimney standing alone, and a heap of black smoking timbers within. The apple trees close to the house had scorched leaves. The maples by the gate were unhurt. The barn and the smokehouse and the small square outbuilding by the hog pen stood untouched, as though the fire had known its business and had wanted only the ochre house. Sheriff Albert Smutzer came out from La Porte at 8 o'clock in the morning in his light spring wagon. He was a young man with a wide moustache and a careful eye. He took one look at the black pit that had been the kitchen and set his men to work with shovels and rakes. Through the long forenoon they turned over the wet ash and the fallen timbers. In the early afternoon, in what had been the cellar, they found 4 bodies. 3 were small. They were the children, Myrtle and Lucy and little Philip, lying close together as though they had been laid there before the fire began. The 4th was a woman. She was a heavy woman, broad in the shoulder and the hip, wrapped in the black remains of a wool skirt. She lay a little apart from the children, on her back, in the sand of the cellar floor beside the fallen brick of the chimney. She had no head. The sheriff stood a long time in the black pit with his hat in his hand. His deputies stood beside him. No one spoke. Somewhere out beyond the picket fence, the hogs behind the barn were moving in their pen, their small dark eyes catching the pale afternoon light, snuffling in the sandy earth as they always snuffled, pressing their pink noses into the ground as though something beneath it stirred. Down the road, from the west, a hired man from a neighbouring farm was already running toward the town with the news, and beyond him, though he did not know it, a train was even then rolling east out of Chicago, along the south shore of Lake Michigan, carrying in one of its coaches a thin, quiet man in a plain brown coat, with a Bible in his grip and his brother's last letter folded in his pocket, and the flat brown fields of Indiana were sliding past his window in the mild spring light, while, on McClung Road, the sheriff bent slowly down beside the headless woman in the cellar of the burned ochre house, and began, at last, to ask the first of the long, hard questions that the sandy soil of LaPorte County had been waiting, for 7 silent years, to answer. The final descent. Sheriff Albert Smutzer did not sleep that night. He set 2 deputies to watch the black pit of the ochre house against souvenir hunters, for word of the fire had already run the length of the county, and by dark a slow line of buggies had drawn up along McClung Road, farmers in their heavy coats craning to see the 4 sheeted shapes laid side by side upon a plank in the barn. The smallest sheet was very small. The largest sheet lay flat where a head should have raised it. In the yellow light of the lanterns, the deputies took off their hats every time a neighbour came near, and the neighbours took off their hats too, and no one spoke above a whisper. The bodies were carried into town the next morning in the plain black wagon of the undertaker, a man named Austin Cutler, who kept his shop on Michigan Avenue and charged $14 for a plain pine coffin lined with muslin. He laid the 4 out in the back room of his shop upon zinc tables, and he closed the door, and he sent for Dr. J. Lucius Gray of Michigan City, who came at the noon train. Dr. Gray examined the heavy woman. He measured her from foot to shoulder with a cloth tape. He weighed the trunk on a livestock scale that Cutler kept for such matters. He wrote in his notebook, in a careful blue pencil, that the woman upon the table was 5 feet 3 inches from heel to shoulder and, allowing for a full head, could not in life have stood above 5 feet 5. He wrote that she weighed perhaps 140 pounds burned and would have weighed no more than 150 in the flesh. Every Norwegian widow in LaPorte knew that Belle Gunness had stood near 5 feet 8 and had weighed above 200. The women who had sat beside her on the hard benches at the church on Osborne Street had had to shift to the right when she came into the pew, for she filled it end to end. The clerks at the First National Bank had seen her lay her broad hand flat on the marble counter, and the hand had covered a folded newspaper. The undertaker looked at the small charred trunk on the zinc table, and he looked at Dr. Gray, and he said only that the fire could not shrink a bone. Dr. Gray nodded and closed his notebook. Outside the shop, on the brick pavement of Michigan Avenue, the talk had already begun. In the roomly hotel across the square, farmers stood at the long oak bar with cups of black coffee and spoke in low Norwegian and low English of the headless woman in the cellar. Sheriff Smutzer had, that same morning, ridden to the small board house of Ray Lamphere on the north edge of town and had arrested him quietly and had brought him back handcuffed to the county jail. Lamphere had wept in the wagon. He had said that he had done nothing, that he had only quarrelled with the widow, that he had drunk too much again on the night before, and had slept it off in a shed on the Wheatbrook place. He said over and over that the widow was a devil and had burned herself out and taken her children with her, and he begged the sheriff to look in the ground. Sheriff Smutzer looked in the ground. He began on the 1st of May in the year 1908, 3 days after the fire, with 4 men and 4 spades and a length of pig wire to sift the sand. The morning was warm. The apple trees in the orchard were opening their small white petals. The hogs behind the barn had been driven off into a neighbour's pen the day before, for the sheriff had wished to walk clean over the ground where they had rooted. He began at a soft place along the fence line, where the earth had settled a little into a shallow trench under the winter rains. His spade went down through the sandy loam. It went down through a scattering of dry corn husks and old straw. It went down through a layer of quicklime that stung the eyes and made the deputies cough into their sleeves. It went down at last upon something that gave under the blade with a soft, dull sound. They cleared the sand back with their hands. There was a piece of coarse burlap sacking. Under the sacking there was a length of grey wool cloth. Under the cloth there was the bone of a shoulder, and next to it, folded upon itself, a body. Then another body beside it, in another piece of sacking. Then, in a hollow a little to the east, a third. Before the sun was full up, they had lifted 4 out of that first trench. Before the sun set, they had lifted 6 more from a second trench nearer the smokehouse. The little square outbuilding by the hog pen had a floor of thick oak plank, and the plank was pried up in the afternoon, and beneath it the sand had been turned and turned again, and in the sand there lay bones and hair and small hard tools of a butcher's trade, and the buckles of men's belts, and the eyelets of men's boots, and the pale enamelled dial of a pocket watch whose hands had stopped at 20 minutes past 3 on some long-forgotten afternoon. By the second day the news was in every paper in the Middle West. The Chicago dailies sent reporters east on the interurban, and they filled the Roomley Hotel and the small boarding houses along Lincoln Way. Special trains ran out from Chicago that Sunday, carrying more than 1,000 curious visitors to the plank platform at Porte. Boys sold picture postcards of the ochre house at 10 cents each on the courthouse square. Farm wives rented their spare bedrooms for $1 a night. A carnival man from Michigan City set up a small stand at the corner of McClung Road and sold hot sausage in a paper wrap for a nickel until the sheriff put him off. All along the picket fence of the widow's 48 acres, men and women stood 10 deep and watched the deputies at their long, slow work. They dug through May. They dug through the first week of June. They lifted, in the end, the parts of at least 12 human beings from the yard, and some careful counters put the number as high as 40 when the smaller bones and the fragments were laid together on the plank tables in Cutler's back room. Some of the dead had names. There was Andrew Helgelien of Mansfield, South Dakota, identified by the shape of his teeth and the watch chain in his pocket, whose brother Asle stood beside the plank table in his plain brown coat and looked down without a word, and then walked out into the wind. There was Ole Budsberg of Iola, Wisconsin, known by a small silver locket his sons had given him. There was John Moe of Elbow Lake, Minnesota, known by a ring upon a finger bone. There was Jenny Olson, the foster child, no longer at any finishing school in California, but found in a soft trench near the picket fence in a plaid dress she had worn on the day she was sent away, in the summer of 1906. Her natural family in Chicago came out on the train that week, and stood a long time by the little coffin in Cutler's shop, and said nothing, and went home. Others had no names. They were only the parts of men who had once carried, sewn into the linings of black wool coats, the savings of small dairies in Wisconsin, and small wheat farms in Dakota, and small pine cabins in the timber country of Michigan, and who had left no letters home that could not be answered by a round schoolgirl hand with warm Christian phrases. The trial of Ray Lamphere began at the county courthouse in Porte on the 9th of November in the year 1908. He was charged with murder and arson for the deaths of the widow and her 3 children. The room was crowded end to end. Farmers stood at the back with their hats in their hands. Newspaper men filled a long table at the front and wrote in their small pencilled books. Lamphere sat beside his lawyer in a plain grey suit, his face thinner than in the spring, his hands trembling upon the wooden rail. He said again what he had said in the wagon on the morning of his arrest. He said he had quarrelled with her. He said he had drunk too much on the night of the fire. He said he had watched the flames from the road a little before dawn, but that he had lit no match and had climbed no stair. He said the widow had burned the ochre house herself, and had put another woman in her own dress in the cellar, and had walked out into the country in the dark with her leather purse in her hand. The state produced its witnesses. The state produced Dr. Gray with his notebook and his blue pencil. The state produced the neighbours who had seen Lamphere on the road at strange hours. The state produced a small black man named Elizabeth Smith, a poor healer known in the West End of town, who said that Lamphere had come to her cabin drunk on a night in April, and had cried at her table that the widow and he had killed too many, and that they must be sure to burn everything now, or they would all hang. Lamphir's lawyer rose and shook his head at her, and asked her 100 small questions, but the story stayed as she had told it. The jury went out at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 25th of November. They came back at breakfast time the next morning. They found Ray Lamphir not guilty of murder. They found him guilty only of arson for the burning of the ochre house. The judge sentenced him to a term of 2 to 21 years at the state prison at Michigan City. He was taken there in a closed wagon the next week, and he died within a year of the tuberculosis that had been eating at his thin chest for a long time. Before he died, he called for a Methodist minister of the prison, a plain, gentle man named Shell, and he told him a longer story than he had told at the trial. He said the widow had killed all of them, the Suitors from the west and the little Jenny Olsen and her own 2 husbands, and that she had promised him, on nights when she was easy with the drink she kept in the parlour cupboard, that she would kill him too when she was done with him. He said the woman in the cellar had been a poor woman from Chicago, hired out as a housekeeper only a few days before, whose head the widow had cut off and carried away in a sack so that no doctor might measure the neck against her own. He said the widow had left the farm on foot before the fire, with her leather purse pinned inside her bodice and her small hard eyes turned west. Reverend Shell wrote it all down. He gave the paper to the newspapers a little later, and the newspapers printed it, and the country read it once and turned the page. Whether Belle Gunness died in the cellar of the ochre house that April night, or whether she walked out into the pale spring dark and rode a train west with a leather purse full of the savings of dead men, was never settled by any court in Indiana. For years afterward, and for many years after that, sheriffs in small towns across the Middle West would send word to Porte that a big, broad woman with a Norwegian voice had been seen in a hotel in Ohio, in a shop in California, in a farmhouse in Mississippi, in a saloon in Oregon. Each report was written into a folder in the county clerk's office and put away in a drawer. Some of the reports were followed and some were not. None of them ever led to a woman who could be shown, past all doubt, to be the widow who had once stood on the porch of the ochre house on McClung Road, singing softly into the snow while her hogs grew fat. The 48 acres passed out of her name. The heirs of the estate were her 3 small children, and her 3 small children lay together in a single grave at Forest Home Cemetery near Chicago, beside their father Mads Sorensen, the small blonde man from the candy shop on Grand Avenue. Their guardian, the old Norwegian pastor she had named in her will, sold the farm to a neighbour within the year, for a price well below what she had paid for it, for no one in LaPorte County wanted to plough the sandy ground behind the orchard, and no one wanted to keep hogs in the pen beside the small square outbuilding. The ochre house was never rebuilt. Its cellar was filled with fresh earth, and its brick chimney was pulled down and carted away, and only a rough square of foundation stones was left in the field, and the maples by the gate grew a little larger with each passing year, and put down a little more shade. For a season or two the curious still came out on the interurban to walk the yard and to break off small pieces of the foundation for their pockets. Then the roads of the country were paved, and the interurban bells fell silent, and the motor cars carried travellers past on other errands, and the memory of the widow at LaPorte began to belong less to the neighbours and more to the yellowed newspaper clippings in county libraries, and to the small pamphlets sold at country fairs, and to the long, slow rumour of the Middle West. In the parish book at Selbu, on a shelf in a small wooden church across a grey sea, the name of Brynhild Polsdatter Sturset still stands in careful brown ink, one line among many, in the hand of a pastor long dead. In the ledger at Castle Garden in the port of New York, on a page thick with the ink of 10,000 tired clerks, the name of Bella Paulson still stands, servant, 21, going to Chicago. In the marriage book of a Norwegian church on Erie Street, and in the deed book of the county courthouse at LaPorte, and in the small tin box of insurance receipts that was carried out of the ochre house on the night of the fire and lost forever, other names stand or once stood. Together they make the whole account. There is no other. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark.